Welcome, everybody, to the economic and social impact of COVID-19 on newcomers to Canada. It's the first ever online conference for the Metropolis COVID-19 Social Impacts Network. Bienvenue à les impacts économiques et sociaux de la COVID-19 sur les nouveaux arrivants au Canada. Il s'agit de la première conférence en ligne de Metropolis et le réseau COVID-19 sur les impacts sociaux. My name is Tasha Carradine, and I'm a public policy analyst, journalist, consultant, wear a lot of hats, but today it is my great pleasure to be the host of your first virtual conference. I've worked with ACS and IOC Metropolis on events in the past. Very honored to be here today for the, I think it's over 1,000 pairs of eyes that are watching us right now. Now, I can't see you, obviously, but you are extremely important, and we look forward to your engagement in this conference today. I also want to say this is a brave new world for the association, both technologically, so bear with us on that, but also, of course, for everyone, including immigrants to Canada in this strange new world that we are living in. Nos vies ont vraiment été bouleversées. Ceux des immigrants ne font aucune exception. Alors, cette conférence va examiner les impacts, les attitudes, les défis, les implications aussi pour les politiques publiques en ce qui concerne les nouveaux arrivants au Canada dans le monde de COVID-19. Now, we were hoping to have simultaneous translation available for you today. We are still working on it. Like I said, technological challenges, and future conferences, we are confident we will be able to provide that. Malheureusement, on n'a pas l'interprétation simultanée aujourd'hui, mais on y travaille très fort et on espère la prochaine fois qu'on vous rejoint en ligne, on aurait cela à votre disposition. I'd like to do a couple of other housekeeping things before we get going. As I mentioned, you are an integral part of the event. We are looking forward to your participation in the Q&A sessions, which will take place after each of the two plenaries. There's 15 minutes reserved for that. The way to do that is to respond not in the chat box, but in the Q&A. C'est très important, si vous voulez soumettre des questions, mettez pas ça dans la fonction chat, mettez ça dans la question et réponse, Q&A. C'est là où on va prendre vos questions. On peut pas les prendre tous. We can't take every question, but we will do our best to answer as many as possible. Finally, this conference is being recorded, and it'll be posted on the ACS IOC website. So if you missed something because you've gone to the fridge for a drink or whatever, don't worry about it. You can catch up there. We also are live streaming the event on Facebook, on the Facebook page of the association. On est direct en ligne sur Facebook. Et on va aussi on va poster l'événement sur le site web de l'AEC. Alors, si vous manquez quelque chose, vous pouvez la rattraper là-bas. We also would greatly appreciate you getting the word out on social media, of course. The hashtags are Social Impacts COVID-19 and COVID-19 Canada. Alors, s'il vous plaît, tweetez, mettez ça sur Facebook, invitez tout le monde que vous connaissez de rejoindre l'événement ou d'avoir des informations que vous mettez sur les réseaux sociaux. Alors, sans plus tarder, j'aimerais introduire notre premier intervenant. On a été supposé d'avoir l'honorable Donna Dasko, sénatrice, mais malheureusement, le Sénat siège aujourd'hui. There's an urgent sitting of the Senate, so unfortunately, Donna Dasko cannot be with us, but we're thrilled to have someone we all know very well, Jack Jedwab, who is, of course, the president of the Association for Canadian Studies Metropolis Canada and the chair of the COVID-19 Social Impact Network. He doesn't really need a big introduction. I'll give him one anyway. Jack has a PhD in Canadian history from Concordia University. He's taught at UQAM and McGill University, and his courses have covered the breadth of immigration in Canada, ethnic minorities in Quebec, immigration in Quebec, official language minorities in Canada, public policy, and sports in Canada. Il contribue également régulièrement à des essais pour des livres, des revues et des journaux à travers le pays, en plus de rédiger diverses publications et rapports gouvernementaux sur la question d'immigration, multiculturalisme, de droits de l'homme et les langues officielles. So, welcome now, Jack Jedwab.
Thank you very much, Tasha, and thank you for agreeing to moderate this online conference. These are difficult times, as you mentioned, for many of us, and we're struggling with finding solutions to dealing with new issues and new problems. And thankfully, got some great leadership that's been at the forefront in giving us guidance as to how we deal with the various situations that we're encountering. Alors, moi, je ne vais pas prendre beaucoup de temps. Je veux aussi réitérer que la sénatrice Dasco était incapable d'être avec nous à cause d'une réunion urgente du Sénat. Mais permettez-moi, avant qu'on procède avec la conférence, permit me, before we proceed, to extend my thanks to my team at the Association for Canadian Studies, led by Sarah Quay and Gillian Aiken and James Ondrick, who helped put this together. Also, the various agencies that have been very supportive of us in terms of the construction of the Social Impacts Network that's been able to generate substantial research over the past month in terms of informing policymakers, researchers, and Canadians in general about some of the key issues that we're confronting. So my thanks to IRCC, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, the Public Health Agency of Canada, the Statistics Canada and its Chief Statistician, Anil Arora, will be with us shortly, to Léger Marketing as well. It's been very helpful in terms of the surveys and other studies we've been generating over the last 4 weeks. Additionally, I also want to thank the Vanier Institute for the Families, that has been a really excellent partner for us, and the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. Let me close on a personal note. My mom is in one of those CHSLDs, in one of those long-term care facilities here in the sort of center of Montreal. And my thoughts are with her, as I'm sure many of you in your thoughts are thinking about family members and feeling concerns about them. I want to take this opportunity to thank the people at the CHSLD Jewish Elder Care for the fantastic work they're doing on the front lines, going in there and making great, great sacrifices. My thoughts are with them today as we begin the conference and we tackle some of these important issues. Alors, juste sur une note personnelle, je voulais remercier les gens à CHSLD Jewish Elder Care à Montréal, à Côte-des-Neiges. Ma mère est dans un de ces centres et mes pensées sont avec elle chaque jour, justement, pendant que nous travaillons ensemble et collectivement afin de trouver des solutions à cette situation sans parallèle. Alors, je vais arrêter là. Et je repasse le rôle de modératrice exceptionnelle de Tasha Kerrigan.
Thanks so much, Jack. Merci beaucoup. And I hope your mother stays safe. It is something that is of horrific concern to everyone here in Ontario, where I'm sitting right now. It's also a very big issue in the long-term care home. So a lot of challenges, and a lot of challenges, obviously, also one can say for immigrants. It's not just new Canadians. It's not just people born here who have their parents in these homes. So language challenges and other things are probably an issue too. Somebody who knows a lot about that is an expert, obviously, on immigration, is our next guest, and that is Katrina Tapley. She's the Deputy Minister for Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. She was appointed to her current position on August 19th, 2019, and prior to this, she served as the Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet for Operations and Privy Council Office. Now, before joining PCO, Ms. Tapley was with Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada from 2010 to 2016, serving as a Senior Assistant Deputy Minister for Strategic and Program Policy and Associate Assistant Deputy Minister. Madame Tapley était chargée de diriger la politique d'immigration et de citoyenneté du Canada concernant la sélection et l'admissibilité des résidents permanents et temporaires et des réfugiés, et d'aider tous les nouveaux arrivants à s'intégrer dans la société et l'économie canadienne. In 2011, Ms. Tapley played a senior role in the creation of the Beyond the Border strategy, the action plan that was part of the Beyond the Border working group. Et la carrière de Mme Tapley, très distinguée dans la fonction politique publique, comprend également de nombreux postes au Conseil du Trésor, au secrétariat, ressources humaines et développement des compétences Canada et pêche et océan Canada. Alors, accueillez maintenant Mme Katrina Tapley.
Hey. Merci beaucoup, Tasha, et merci de m'avoir invité. Pour commencer, je tiens à dire quelque chose que vous entendez très souvent ces temps-ci. Il s'agit d'une période extraordinaire. Like many other departments, we watched what was happening in China and wondered what this would mean for IRCC. We started looking down at our own business continuity plans, what PPE we had or needed for frontline staff. how ready were we to operate in a Wuhan-like lockdown environment, all just in case? It seemed a bit academic at the time, watching from Canada, then suddenly it was our reality. And I'd love to say that we were 100% prepared and ready by the time it became clear that this was becoming a global pandemic, but I don't think anybody could claim that. Those early days for us were dominated by repatriation and border issues. IRCC was facilitating visas and travel documents for the Canadians that were being repatriated. The pace was intense and it has not let up. Now, to be clear, we're not the public health agency, but for us, it was pretty intense. Nous avons joué un rôle important dans les mesures prises en vue de fermer les frontières, d'assurer la sécurité des Canadiens et dans les mesures nécessaires pour poursuivre les prestations de services aux personnes se trouvant au Canada et pour répondre aux besoins des clients à l'étranger. À l'immigration, réfugiés et citoyenneté Canada, nous avons adopté une approche axée sur les personnes dans la mise en œuvre des changements. Et elles demeureront notre priorité dans l'évaluation des changements supplémentaires que nous devons apporter en cette période particulière. The original travel restrictions for foreign nationals flying into Canada from abroad or those coming across the US land border was an enormous lift for many departments. But for us, the real work was in carving out the exceptions. It was important to strike a balance between public health imperatives and the urgent economic needs of our country and the human needs of reuniting families. As you know, we made some exceptions to meet the country's essential needs and obligations, such as healthcare, support, our food supply. For example, exempting temporary foreign workers was imperative to ensure the maintenance of Canada's food production, with spring being a pretty critical time for agriculture and agri-food producers. In addition, we wanted to ensure that other vitally important workers, such as healthcare workers, caregivers, emergency services, truck drivers, among others, were able to come to Canada and play an important role in the effort to keep Canadians healthy and safe. We've also done a lot of work around international students, and I know that there's still more to come on this, but this group is key to Canada's present in financially supporting our colleges and universities, but also supporting many towns. And students are key to our future, as many transition to permanent residency, bringing skills and innovation to our country. One of the recent announcements on this front was to allow international students to work over their limit of 20 hours per week while they were still in school if they were working in an essential service or function, such as healthcare, critical infrastructure, or the supply of food and other critical goods. We have quite a long list now of facilitative measures in place for those in our country working, studying, who are fait accompli. Nous continuons d'évaluer les situations et nos opérations afin d'apporter les modifications nécessaires. And we continue to grapple with offering our frontline services in a way that respects the needs to isolate and distance, and in a way that protects our employees and our clients. So I think we're getting there on most of it. For example, we've begun to do permanent resident landings by phone, and we did our first ever virtual citizenship ceremony. And we're exploring the possibility of doing more in the future. Our call center operators have been quickly trained up on new software they can use from home. So we're back in business helping clients by phone instead of just email. And despite the current travel restrictions, IRCC continues to accept and process applications. We remain very much open for business. Finally, I want to note that the COVID situation has affected the settlement and resettlement efforts. Here, okay, I see that message there. That's better. Of our many service provider organizations. So I want to do a little shout out to our service provider organizations and thank them for their important contributions throughout this period. They've been working through options to reach their clients, especially the most vulnerable, and provide services by telephone, email, online. And they've also provided us with guidance on counseling newcomers about COVID-19 measures, including required physical isolation. I should also add that despite these challenging times, many of these organizations have also worked with us to finalize the call for proposals so that we're in good situation as we go forward in the future to make sure that settlement services continue. Looking ahead, Je tiens à remercier notre ministre du leadership dont elle a fait preuve pendant cette période. As many of you know, Minister Mendicino is extremely active and engaged. It pushes us to innovate and adapt to the needs of our clients, and I think this will be important as we move from crisis to recovery. We know that there will be high unemployment. The debt has grown, people, countries will need to heal. Lives and futures will be changed, even if we aren't sure how at this point. But I am sure of this: immigration will continue to play a vital role in our economic success. To aid our recovery in the short term, we will need immigrants who have come or will come to Canada shortly. De plus, à long terme, nous serons toujours confrontés à la réalité démographique, qui est le vieillissement de la population active, et cette situation représentera un argument convaincant continu en faveur de la prise de mesures dynamiques visant l'immigration. The immigration portfolio has taught me many things, but the past several weeks have taught me more. How we need to see and rely on each other as people first, and that we need to take the talents and skills of people who immigrate here to make this country even better. I hope we'll be looking back on these extraordinary times, but for now, be safe and well. Merci encore une fois de m'avoir invité. Merci.
Thank you so much, Katrina Tapley. Really appreciate it. Katrina Tapley, the Deputy Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, and probably one of the most challenging portfolios right now, considering challenges to mobility in and out of the country and even within our own country. Of course, also challenges for health. Health is the big one that's on the front lines, literally. So I'm really pleased to introduce our next speaker, Tina Nemianowski. She is the president of the Public Health Agency of Canada. She was appointed to that role May 6th, 2019. Previously, she was the executive vice president of the Canadian Border Services Agency. And Ms. Nemianowski has also held assistant deputy minister roles at Ag Canada, Public Safety Canada, and has served as assistant secretary to Cabinet Operations Secretariat with the Privy Council Office. She joined the federal government in 1989, which brings extensive experience in policy development, program delivery, and international relations. Madame Nemianowski est titulaire d'un baccalauréat spécialisé avec majeur en sciences politiques et mineur en histoire de l'Université Carleton. Elle a également obtenu une maîtrise en sciences politiques avec une concentration en études stratégiques et relations internationales à l'Université Dalhousie. Madame Nemianowski, à vous.
OK. So, merci beaucoup pour l'invitation. C'est un grand plaisir pour moi d'être ici aujourd'hui. Quand j'ai eu un appel avec Jack, ou j'ai eu un courriel de Jack, où il m'a demandé si c'était possible pour nous de participer dans cet événement, mais aussi d'être to be involved with the work that he's leading, which is very much part of the conference that is being run today. As I was sitting here thinking about my colleague Katrina, who we're working very closely with, along with many others across the entire federal family, it's really hard to think about, how short the time has really been in terms of the number of days that we have really, been experiencing the crisis that we're under. When I think about, today is the 1st of May, it was really just 4 months ago that we became aware of, the situation that was unfolding in China. And I do remember the early messaging at the end of December that basically indicated, there had been a small cluster of cases of unknown viral pneumonia in Wuhan, China. And it's just quite incredible to think about all that has happened between the end of December, early January, and today, and the kind of impact that has been felt globally around the world. I think it's pretty overwhelming. And I know from the point of view of our agency, it has been something that has been all-consuming, and it's certainly something that our agency has been engaged in from day one. And I must admit, we've been going hard at it for for many, many weeks. So it feels like many, many years at this point. But in reality, when you just think about, 4 months, it doesn't seem like a long period of time, but so much has happened. So it's a huge pleasure for me to be here today. This is obviously an extremely important conference. I think from, our perspective, la priorité pour nous, c'est toujours la santé et la sécurité des Canadiennes. It is something that is front of mind for us. It has been from the very beginning. And it is something that our minister speaks to on a continuous basis, the public health considerations that are really underpinning everything that we do. And les objectifs pour nous, c'est toujours, ils sont basés sur les principes fondamentaux en santé publique. It's about preventing outbreaks and to the extent that that's possible, and really protecting the most vulnerable. Jack made reference earlier to his mother being in, one of the long-term care homes in Quebec. Tasha, you made reference to the ones in Ontario. I think we've really seen across the country that some of the most vulnerable are some of the individuals that are the most susceptible to some of the most severe outcomes associated with COVID-19. And I think that, there's been a lot of emphasis placed on ensuring that to the extent possible, everything is being done to protect the most vulnerable in society. And that is something that has been a continuous focus of conversation between, my minister and all of her ministerial, provincial and territorial counterparts, as well as at the federal level. And it's not just an issue of vulnerability associated with long-term care homes. There's a huge recognition that there are other vulnerable populations in Canada that also are worthy and deserving of real focused attention. And together with all of our provincial and territorial partners, we've spent a lot of time, energy, and effort really working through how can we do the maximum amount possible to really reduce the negative impact on the vulnerable populations in Canada. But I think it's also been broadly about how do we ensure that Canada steps up and does the right thing in terms of all of the public health measures that have been put in place that have really made a fundamental difference in the way that Canada has been able to deal with COVID-19. And I know that is very much part of the conversation that's going to happen today, in terms of, really understanding the impacts as a result of some of those pretty extreme measures that have happened, and understanding them from a social perspective, an economic perspective, and all of the other considerations that relate to, what happens when a country takes the kind of extreme measures that we've had to take. And thankfully, Canadians have been incredibly compliant. We could not do this without the participation and the commitment of everybody within Canada. It's just been an outstanding, response. And I think when we look back on this in, hopefully the not too distant future, that we'll really have a sense through the work such as being done in this conference as to, what were the implications associated with having to take some of those decisions. So we're very, very focused and remain very focused on working, together as a federation, and really making sure that we're mitigating to the extent possible all of the negative impacts, both from a health perspective, but as well social and economic. We're very and remain very focused on testing. We remain very focused on treating. We remain very focused on research and development, and everything that needs to happen in terms of really trying to find a way forward. I think from our perspective, it's a great opportunity to be working, very closely with all of you to really understand, the social impacts network. Your work, your statistical and qualitative research from our perspective is critical. And of course, in recent days, we've heard a lot of discussion around recovery and moving to the next phase in terms of how we restart the economy and society, which is something that my incredible colleague, Dr. Teresa Tam, has talked about also, which is really in a way that is cautious, measured, that is deliberate, and that ensures that we continue to place great emphasis on ensuring that we're very focused on on public health and reopening our economy in such a way that we're really able to maintain epidemic control, which is fundamental for us in Canada. It is very much a focus for nations around the globe. So I think from the point of view of particular areas of interest for us, and where you and your research colleagues can really help us, is really giving us a better understanding through your work of the health impacts from our social measures, from elders living alone to women and children, the kind of experiences that we've seen in terms of, we know there's been an increase, for example, in the number of people that are phoning helplines linked to domestic and other forms of violence. To those that are living with accessibility challenges or medical or any kind of mental health preconditions, it's really important for us to understand, how lives have been affected by things like social distancing, to ensure that we understand what the implications are and that we're able to the extent possible mitigate any potential downside to those measures. We've already mentioned it, il y a des personnes et des communautés vulnérables qui représentent un autre domaine d'intérêt pour nous. Les personnes vivant dans des milieux communautaires comme long-term care homes, les prisons, les travailleurs essentiels, les minorités visibles, les nouveaux arrivants au Canada et d'autres groupes. Il faut nous assurer que nous répondons adéquatement à leurs besoins. Public trust is also something that continues to be a very critical consideration for us. And so the question is, remains as to whether or not we've done enough citizen engagement in terms of the science and explaining the science and ensuring that Canadians truly understand, the rationale behind the decisions that have been taken. And that will have to continue to be taken as we move forward, because we know that, the likelihood of there being a vaccine is not something that is going to happen in the next day or two. So it is really true that we're going to be living with the new normal for quite a period of time to come. So that's something that, again, from our perspective, is a critical consideration. Obviously, our relationship with the external world is one that is also very important to us. And when we think about, our borders have been closed now for a number of weeks to all foreign nationals, with some limited exceptions for essential workers and the like. And that we know is very challenging for individuals, particularly those who have family members abroad and who would more typically, be traveling and able to connect in families in different ways from the point of view and being able to physically, be able to connect, which is obviously something that has been impacted by some of the measures taken. We know that some of those measures have impacts on, the immigration policy that Katrina just spoke to. And we know that the impacts have also forced us to really rethink about how we maintain contact and, take advantage of some of the technologies that are available to all of us, including the ability to hold a conference such as this one using web-based technologies. And I can say, from the point of view of myself and my colleagues at the Public Health Agency of Canada, we are very driven by all of the public health measures that are put in place. And we have found a way to work together and continue to work together, I would say, 7 days a week with some pretty long hours over the course of the last number of months. But we're doing it in a way that, again, is respectful of all of the social distancing and other public health measures that have been put in place. So maybe I will just stop there, but say one final point, which is really, we're so pleased to be part of this event. We're very, very interested in the areas of study that will be part of your discussions today. We're very appreciative of all of the incredible work that's done, and we welcome further collaboration in the future. And with that, perhaps I will just bring my comments to a close. Alors, un grand remerciement à tous et à toutes. C'est une opportunité exceptionnelle d'être ici avec vous, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing the outcomes. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina. Nemyanowski. I'm doing my best there. Sorry. And yeah, work-life balance is something I think everyone's trying to figure out. People are working longer hours than ever before, even though they're at home. and in public health, I know other people in the departments here in Ontario who are really working around the clock. So thank you for all your work that you're doing. I also want to say that one of the things you mentioned was very interesting, that you obviously want to move forward based on advanced decision making, and part of that, of course, is a collection of data, which brings me to our next guest, someone who works with the Social Impact Network. In fact, in helping us, we work with Statistics Canada to get the best information possible to find out what people are thinking and how this crisis is affecting them. So I'd like to now welcome Neil Aurora. He's the Chief Statistician of Canada for Statistics Canada. He's a very experienced senior public official, having worked at StatsCan for over 25 years, leading very significant programs and transformations. Monsieur Aurora s'est vu décerner un baccalauréat en sciences de l'Université de l'Alberta et ensuite a étudié en informatique. Il a obtenu un certificat d'études supérieures en gestion avancée dans le secteur public à l'Université d'Ottawa et a suivi le programme avancé en leadership du gouvernement du Canada. Mr. Aurora, the floor is yours now.
Well, thank you very much, Tasha. It's a real honor for me to be here with all of you participating in this online conference on the economic and social impacts of COVID-19 on newcomers to Canada. I want to start by congratulating Metropolis Canada, the Vanier Institute for the Family, the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, and the Association for Canadian Studies for hosting this important event today. I would also like to recognize the leadership of Jack Jedwab for having established the COVID-19 Social Impacts Network that regularly brings together researchers from across sectors and disciplines. And this network is helping to coordinate the approach on social research during these trying times. And these efforts will surely benefit Canadian society, as a number of my colleagues have mentioned so far. I know that we at Statistics Canada are certainly proud, and I know that we benefit from all the insights that we gain from our participation in this network, and then being able to turn those to Canadians for important decisions that impact us all. L'ampleur de la crise de COVID-19 est sans précédent. Dans nos vies, aucune de nous n'a vécu un virus qui a eu un effet aussi profond sur la santé, les activités sociales et économiques des Canadiens. Nous nous sommes retrouvés dans cette situation du jour au lendemain. En mars, les gouvernements à travers le Canada et le monde ont débuté l'exécution de mesures extraordinaires pour réduire la propagation de la COVID-19. Depuis les 6 dernières semaines, nous nous sommes ajustés à une nouvelle norme qui semble changer quotidiennement sous nos pieds. These are undoubtedly challenging times, and I really want to recognize the leadership that so many of you today who are attending are exercising in your day-to-day activities, the sacrifices that you're making, and I just want to say I salute you. And when times are challenging, it's really more important than ever to reach out to our friends, to listen to one another, and to offer our support and to seek support ourselves. And this is why I'm so happy to be here with all of you today. Together, we're collecting the data, the insights that matter to Canadians and Canadian institutions. We're informing the policy decisions that are helping to protect Canadians, that will serve the needs of Canadians through this pandemic, and that'll help us to restart our economy when the timing is right. We're placing data at the heart of our leaders' most important decisions and reinforcing the trust that Canadians have in their government that Tina and Katrina have mentioned already. There's no question that COVID-19 will shape our collective conscience for the foreseeable future. It'll be imperative for us to continue to work together to learn from this experience and continue to adapt to better serve Canadians going forward. At Statistics Canada, we're responding to this unprecedented situation by adopting new and innovative ways of doing our work in order to provide the kind of data and insights that Canadians need to respond to COVID-19. And this includes launching the new ways of collecting information in near time through web panels, crowdsourcing, to altering the way we carry out our legacy programs, such as even the labor force survey. Through these tools, we've learned that seniors, for example, are most concerned about their health and maintaining social ties, while younger Canadians are worried about meeting financial obligations and other social consequences, such as civil unrest. We've also learned that young women are the most likely to be concerned about violence in their home compared to others. We also see that people are adapting the way that they're doing things because of the pandemic. For example, older Canadians are visiting grocery and drugstores less frequently and making greater use of delivery services. We're grateful to our partners who are helping us to promote these new tools to respondents. As a result, Canadians have responded. Our initial crowdsourcing received an unprecedented 240,000 plus responses in the first 2 weeks from all provinces and territories. Given the large number of Canadians participating, we've added questions related to immigrant status, visible minority status, and Indigenous status to both the crowdsourcing and the web panel questionnaires to look at how COVID-19 is impacting different segments of our population and those that sometimes can be the most vulnerable. And these questions combined with, for example, postal code data will allow us to further disaggregate data and to make sure that the policy decisions are targeted towards that most need our help at this stage. So as we start the conference today, I want to leave you with 3 key messages. Firstly, partnerships are fundamental. Collectively, we're greater than the sum of our individual parts. Let's take advantage of the opportunity that COVID-19 has presented us to strengthen our working relationships. Let's find new and innovative ways to work together. Secondly, our collective efforts will be key in restarting the economy and our society more broadly. It'll be our job to keep one eye on our traditional indicators of success and another eye on new indicators that tell us how the individuals that make up our communities are in fact doing day to day and throughout this evolving context. We'll have to be mindful to watch how our kids are doing coming out of this pandemic. How about small business owners and those in the nonprofit sectors? And how will our communities fare? Will they remain cohesive or will we see divisions growing over time? Going forward, we'll need to stay on this journey together. Troisièmement, cette pandémie ne sera pas unique. Nous ne sommes pas convaincus quelle forme la prochaine crise prendra, mais nous savons qu'il y en aura une seconde. Soyons tous d'accord pour apprendre de cette crise afin de s'assurer d'être autant plus équipés pour le suivant. Nous voyons que ce sont les membres les plus vulnérables de notre société qui sont le plus affectés, que ce soit par la perte d'emploi, la perte de chèque de paie, la maladie et pour quelques cas vivent de pires destins. Assurons-nous tous que nous utilisons les données pour identifier et protéger les membres les plus vulnérables de notre société. Explorons également les conséquences positives involontaires de cette pandémie pour changer la façon dont nous procédons, et c'est pour le meilleur. Engageons-nous les uns envers les autres à maintenir un bon inventaire pour nous assurer que nous tirons les leçons de cette expérience et à utiliser les données générées par cette pandémie pour servir le plus grand bien pour l'avenir. So in closing, this pandemic is truly a defining challenge of our times. In order to continue to serve Canadians and to help the country to land on its feet over the coming months, it is going to take all of us pulling together in the same direction. And I want you to know that we at Statistics Canada are here. We will do our part to fill critical data gaps and provide useful, timely analyses to you, our partners. Je vous souhaite une journée de conférence productive à tous. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Anil. Anil Arora is, of course, Chief Statistician of Statistics Canada, and we'll hold you to that because data is critical, and there's a real hunger out there for data, but it has to be accurate data. So Statistics Canada's work is very, very important right now, and we thank you. Our next speaker is going to be addressing the international implications of this crisis. Obviously, when you talk about newcomers to Canada, they come from all over the world, and this is a global event, global epidemic. Sébastien Goupil is the Secretary General for the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. Monsieur Goupil s'est joint à la fonction publique fédérale en 2002 et a consacré l'essentiel de sa carrière à l'élaboration de politiques culturelles et sociales. Il vient à la commission de son rôle en tant que secrétaire corporatif par intérim et chef de cabinet bibliothécaire et archiviste du Canada à la Bibliothèque nationale du Canada, Bibliothèque et Archives Canada, pardon. Prior to this, he has the distinction of being the first male to sit on the Executive Committee of Status of Women Canada. That must have been interesting, where he led policy and external relations. Sébastien was instrumental in strengthening Canada's approach to gender mainstreaming. He's also served as Director of Policy and Governance at Portfolio Affairs at the Department of Canadian Heritage and in senior advisor roles, including at Citizenship and Immigration Canada. So please welcome now, bienvenue à Monsieur Sébastien Goupil.
Merci beaucoup, Tasha, distingués collègues, cher Jack, chers participants. Nous sommes très heureux à la Commission canadienne pour l'UNESCO de nous associer à Metropolis Canada, à l'Association des études canadiennes et à l'Institut Vanier pour cette conférence. Et je vous remercie de me donner l'occasion de dire quelques mots d'ouverture. Plusieurs l'ont dit, on vit une crise historique sans précédent qui entraîne depuis plusieurs semaines son lot de défis pour les individus, les familles, les villes, les pays, mais aussi pour les organisations internationales comme l'UNESCO, l'Organisation des Nations Unies pour l'éducation, la science et la culture. L'UNESCO travaille sans relâche depuis les derniers mois pour aider à organiser certaines réponses, entre autres dans le domaine de l'éducation et de la science. Comme on le sait, la crise qu'on traverse n'est pas juste sanitaire, c'est aussi une profonde crise socio-économique. Et c'est préoccupant parce qu'on parle présentement d'un recul de 10 ans dans les efforts de lutte contre la pauvreté dans plusieurs parties du monde. Et plusieurs sont malheureusement convaincus qu'il sera extrêmement difficile, sinon impossible, d'atteindre les objectifs de développement durable des Nations Unies à l'horizon 2030. Et on notait déjà un manque de progrès sur la question. Comme plusieurs, on a une pensée toute spéciale à la Commission pour les nouveaux arrivants, les personnes racisées d'ascendance africaine, ainsi que pour les personnes marginalisées comme les sans-abri, qui sont souvent les victimes oubliées de ce genre de crise. Et c'est intéressant, on portait à mon attention ce matin un nouveau rapport de Statican qui parle du manque de stabilité financière, puis de manque de réseaux sociaux, en particulier chez les nouveaux arrivants. Il y a évidemment toutes sortes de questions importantes liées à la mission de l'UNESCO et de notre commission qui nous préoccupent actuellement. Je pense par exemple à la question des violences envers les femmes et les filles, aux défis posés par la désinformation ou le manque d'accès à de l'information juste et de qualité. Il y a des efforts en cours pour fournir ces informations-là dans plusieurs langues. Je pense aussi aux nouvelles formes de racisme subies notamment par les personnes d'ascendance asiatique. La discrimination et le profilage social et racial semblent aussi connaître une nouvelle recrudescence. Et ce sont tous des enjeux auxquels on essaie de s'attaquer comme commission, bien évidemment avec les membres de nos réseaux, dont les 80 villes qui font partie de notre coalition des municipalités inclusives. We are also increasingly conscious of the role that environmental racism is playing in the pandemic, especially how certain communities have been especially exposed to air pollution or remain concentrated in crowded and deprived neighborhoods with limited access to basic services and even access to nature. And this is why we did not hesitate to partner for the creation of the COVID-19 social impact networks. It's so relevant to our mandate and that of UNESCO. One thing is crystal clear to us. Every day, COVID-19 brings questions of privilege into high relief. I would guess that many of us participating today have secure jobs, good internet connections, backyards, and full cupboards. We know, however, that others in our society and in the world are obliged to work in very risky situations, live in cramped conditions, make difficult choices around child and family care, and rely on food banks to sustain their basic needs. And factors such as race, age, gender, economic status, being a refugee or a newcomer, the housing situation are playing such a huge role, not just in the health of Canadians, but also in their diverse experiences of the pandemic. It is clear, and we've heard it from Katrina and Tina and Anil, we need to improve our understanding of these issues to craft the appropriate policy and programming responses. I will close by saying that we know that today's gathering is about the social and economic impacts of COVID-19 on newcomers. But I would like to stress that we also need to better understand how the pandemic is affecting Indigenous peoples who are still fighting the impact of colonialism and the effects of displacement in Canada and elsewhere in the world. Moreover, since seniors are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19, there is a huge risk to cultural survival. Elders often remaining keepers of languages, stories, and cultures that we can all learn from, including to build more sustainable and resilient future. As a commission, we're also very eager to learn more about how youth and students from different backgrounds react and cope. The research released last week by StatsCan shows that youth are very concerned about the social and mental health impacts of the pandemic. They also feel that their present and future hang in the balance. This is a profound teaching moment for our society, where we see the exacerbation and impacts of economic exclusion, discrimination, inequalities, and iniquities. And I believe, or at least I profoundly hope, that we are willing to learn from our mistakes and change. And I strongly believe that we collectively have an opportunity to reinvent the way we address those challenges by stepping up and working together. And I firmly believe that multilateralism has been questioned a lot over the recent years, and it's more needed than ever. And we need more than ever an organization like UNESCO who can help us also bring the best of the world, the best of collaboration and scientific cooperation to go through this pandemic. So I want to thank you, and I wish you very fruitful exchanges. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Sébastien, pour ces propos. Et c'est vrai, il y a tant de défis sur tant de niveaux. C'est parfois difficile de savoir où commencer. La santé mentale, le bien-être des individus économiques. Une chose est certaine, c'est qu'il faut avoir des données pour être capable de prendre des décisions. Alors, ça nous revient à notre prochain invité. We're going to start now the plenary, the first plenary that we have. And just before I introduce our distinguished speaker who will be moderating that plenary, I want to just take a note, housekeeping here. If you want to submit a question to any of the participants in the plenary, there will be 15 minutes at the end of it to do so, to ask these questions. You should submit them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not in chat, please, Q&A. Si vous voulez soumettre des questions aux participants à la plénière qu'on va entendre maintenant, s'il vous plaît, soumettez-les la fonction Q&A en bas de votre écran, pas dans la fonction chat. Et on va être capable de répondre à beaucoup de vos questions, on espère. Pas tous, mais il y a 15 minutes à la fin de la plénière pour ce faire. Alors, sans plus tarder, on va commencer la plénière numéro 1. We will start the first plenary, Statistical Data Analysis of COVID-19 Impact on Newcomers, What the Numbers Tell Us. And to moderate that panel and introduce them as well, we're joined by our chair, Jane Badetz. She is the Assistant Chief Statistician retired from Statistics Canada, but she's not retired today. She's talking to us. She was Canada's Assistant Chief Statistician in Social, Health, and Labour at Statistics Canada. Throughout her career, Jane had responsibility for a broad range of social statistics, from the census, from surveys and administrative data sets, including stats on demography, education, labor, income, health, justice, ethnocultural background, language, immigration, and Indigenous people. She knows Canada probably better than anyone else on this panel. Elle était également responsable du programme d'accès aux microdonnées de Statistique Canada, y compris les centres de données de recherche. So welcome, Jane, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can everyone see me and hear me, I hope? So, bienvenue à la première session plénière sur les données statistiques. I'm really pleased to be chairing this, and I think it's going to be really exciting. We're going to be highlighting, there's 4 presenters today, and they will be highlighting results from some very new data. Data that has been mainly through surveys through March and April, so very new, and they will shed light on the socioeconomic situation of Canadians, but more importantly on immigrants, newcomers, established immigrants, how they're doing, how are they coping or not, their vulnerabilities. They will touch on their behaviors, attitudes, and concerns. So this is really exciting for someone who spent her whole career in data. I'm super excited. And I think it will be important for us to have a good discussion around where do we go from here? What are the data gaps? And what else do we need to do? And maybe frame some of the research questions. So we have 4 speakers today. On a 4 personnes qui va présenter dans cette session. Je crois que la plupart ont des présentations aussi. They are going to be sharing presentations with us. Vous pouvez poser des questions sur le Q&A, sur le bouton, and I'll be monitoring those questions. And at the end, so the session is about 1 hour and 15 minutes, and I'll be posing some of those questions at the end of all of that session once they present it. So I think we have about 1 hour and 15 minutes for this session, so we should be able to have very interesting presentations and discussions. So to begin, the session is Mieke Boss, and she's the Director General in charge of Research and Evaluation at the Federal Department of Immigration, Refugees, Citizenship Canada, IRCC. Mieke.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? I assume that is the case. I have a presentation which I'm going to try and bring up on the screen, so please bear with me for a second. If it doesn't work out, I'll just speak of my notes. So I'm hoping this works. Hoping that you can see my presentation. So the first thing I would like to do is to thank the organizers, the Association for Canadian Studies, Metropolis Canada, the Vanier Institute for the Family, excuse me, the Canadian Commission for UNESCO for taking this initiative. And I must admit, I've been really struck by the initial presenters, how the different dimensions of this crisis hang together, and that I think the benefit of this initiative is that we are bringing so many different stakeholders together and looking at the response from multiple angles, which I think is really beneficial. J'aimerais d'abord présenter mes excuses. J'avais compté sur une traduction, simultaneous interpretation, donc j'ai préparé ma présentation en anglais. Évidemment, je serai tout à fait prête à répondre à vos questions en français également. Je vais quand même essayer de dire quelques mots de temps en temps en français. Donc, encore un grand merci aux organisations qui ont pris l'initiative d'organiser cette session. The first thing I have to say, and this was also underlined when I was listening to Katrina, I have not been at the forefront of the crisis response for the Department of Immigration. As the DG for Evaluation and Research, we tend to work a little bit more in the background and not in the here and now and the quick crisis response. But as we are starting to turn our attention from crisis response to business resumption and planning, our work is going to be of greater importance. So that is what I will be focusing on. I also explained when Jack was kind enough to invite me that we don't actually have any sort of current research. We're just really starting to look at this, but I think it's the forward agenda that is important, and we'll be drawing on past research also to set our baselines. So today I wanted to talk about, so the topic is COVID-19 and immigration. So the first bullet is simply a reminder that Canada's immigration system does serve different purposes and is delivered through multiple operational channels. We bring people to Canada for economic, social, and humanitarian outcomes. Out of the approximately 340,000 immigrants and permanent residents that the department brought in last year, Close to 60% fall in the economic class. Just over 1/4 are family reunification clients, and about 15% are brought in for humanitarian reasons. They're mostly refugees. So it's important to keep that in mind, that our immigration system serves different purposes. The impacts of COVID-19 could have a profound and long-lasting impact on the management of Canada's immigration system, both the refugee settlement and citizenship programs, both in terms of the what, but also in terms of the how. It's obviously too early to tell what the impact of COVID-19 will be on Canada's immigration programs and the longer term impacts, but we don't know the longer term impacts right now, but we're definitely seeing some of the early impacts. Our landings are obviously already behind because a large part of the system is completely closed down. We may not reach our target this year. There has already been a fundamental shift in how we work, and Katrina Tapley in her introduction mentioned this. We had the first digital citizenship ceremony, never done before. We're doing immigration landings by phone. Our call center has completely restarted working remotely. So I think we are transforming and innovating as a result of this crisis. I'm at the next slide. I'm on slide 3. This is intended to be a bit of a graphic depiction of the situation and where we are right now. So we went through a phase of what we call deep disruption. International travel to Canada decreased by over 95%. IRCC's workforce was down to 40%. Huge impact on processing, of course. Our partners closed or were limited to essential services. The visa application centers overseas were mostly closed. Service provider organizations, this will be in the second panel, severely impacted. Collection of biometrics obviously impacted. Service Canada offices closed. Other federal departments and provinces and territories are in business continuity mode. We, by the way, IRCC is not in business continuity mode. We have been able to pretty much continue working with exceptions in pockets, but it's been pretty remarkable how well we've been able to continue working considering the situation. And of course, Parliament and Cabinet focused almost exclusively on COVID-19. So we feel that we are maybe just sort of over the initial hump of the crisis, and that we're starting to look forward towards the recovery phase and what the new normal may look like. We're still in that middle phase where we're adapting and addressing the immediate situation. Putting into place facilitation measures will continue to be important, and also assisting, of course, the broader Government of Canada effort. But we're really starting to turn our heads now towards the recovery phase and the planning for business resumption. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few seconds. So very briefly, I think you mostly know this through the media, but I do want to highlight it. The Government of Canada and our department have done amazing work in a very short period of time to, first of all, to deal with the travel, the closure of the borders, basically. Started with flights from certain destinations, and then more broadly, closure of the US-Canada-US border to all but basically commercial traffic. So huge implications if you think about that. And the sets of regulatory measures that had to be put in place, and then the exemptions, and Katrina Tapley mentioned this as well, the supporting the client facilitation, making sure that essential workers, students could stay, that temporary foreign workers were able to come into the country. And just hats off to my colleagues, the amount of work that they have done in a very short period of time is unprecedented. And for those of you familiar with how the federal government works, normally these processes take a long time, certainly regulatory and legislative processes. So really quite something else. Obviously, we also continue to support the broader Government of Canada effort and international dialogue and collaboration with partners. So we're starting to look forward to recovery. And as we do that, we need to have a look at what we call the drivers, the traditional drivers of immigration, and what the future of these drivers is. Obviously, the first one is the economy. The shock to the economy, leading to a period of economic stress and adjustment, is again unprecedented. I've mentioned a few numbers here, but my colleague Marc Lachance from Statistics Canada will obviously be adding more. And these are dated numbers as well. I think once we see the April numbers, this will be even more pronounced. So the jump, the hit to GDP, the drop in employment, the jump in unemployment, again, massive and unprecedented. Unemployment is, PBO projection is anticipated to rise to 15% by the third quarter of 2020. And then the third bullet, many COVID-driven layoffs are expected to be temporary. However, prolonged disruptions to the economy and the labor market could lead to job losses in some sectors. So Canada's economic recovery, whether at the national, provincial, territorial, or municipal levels or by sector, will be a key determining factor for immigration priorities. Intensified competition for jobs will highlight the importance of human capital and the ability to meet targeted labor needs. And the employment of domestic workers is likely to be prioritized and complemented with permanent and temporary immigration used to respond to labor shortages in certain sectors. On the next slide, I continue to talk about these drivers. So immigration is traditionally a real stimulus for tourism, youth mobility, and international education sectors. Of course, the air industry, international travel massively impacted and could take a while. The education sector, Katrina Tappé mentioned students. There's a lot of work going on right now trying to ensure that students are able to restart courses in the fall of 2020. Already a lot of accommodations have been made, both in terms of allowing students to work, postgraduate work permits. There's a constant adjustment and facilitation happening there. The last bullet that I mentioned here is the social cohesion, what will be the fallout from this situation. I think this is, I really look forward to hearing some of the other speakers talking about this as well, but this is very important for us as well, because as the pollsters who will come after know, immigration is traditionally in an area of very strong and stable support from the government, from the Canadian population, but we will have to watch that and make sure that there's no increase in tensions and that social cohesion is not jeopardized. So we are turning our attention to planning for recovery. The workforce of IRCC and our partner capacity will need continued consideration as shifts in priorities may require reallocation of resources, funds, people, talent. The restart is expected to be staggered, with segments of the population resuming activity and gradual relaxation of travel restrictions. So what we're doing right now is we're starting to do scenario development, and basically we will look at we'll be mapping out different scenarios. We'll look at the ability of the economy to restart, and we'll look at the degree to travel restrictions stay in place, and we'll combine that with our ability to restart. Scenario work is often helpful to sort of work your way through a number of planning scenarios, just so that we're going to be able to restart our work as smoothly as possible, taking into account all the constraints that exist. Will be dependent on depth, duration, and shape of the recovery across the world, the impact of the emergency response, and the evolution of the COVID epidemiology, of course. And then domestic and international attitudes towards travel and migration will play a great role as well. So the last part of my presentation, I wanted to briefly talk about what this means for our research agenda. So our research is expected to focus on three big sort of main areas of work. So first of all, what has been the effect of the pandemic on established and recent immigrants, and what will be the effect in the post-COVID scenarios? how did the pandemic impact them? And was it different from the impact on Canadian-born? What does the performance of immigrants during and after past recessions tell us about the potential impact on established and recent immigrants? And this part of the work we've started already. We've started looking at looking back 20, 30 years, look at past recessions and seeing whether immigrants may be more vulnerable. And I think early indications are that they will be and that they have been. In particular, newer arrivals. I think my colleague from StatsCan will have an interesting slide on this as well. And then what has been the effect of the pandemic on temporary residents? How have international students fared? How have they coped during this crisis? The role of TFWs, temporary foreign workers. This is really, the spotlight has really been put on the role of our dependency on certain temporary foreign workers. Will we be transitioning more of them to permanent residency? Will there be an impact on our immigration levels moving forward? I'm mindful of the time. I'm wrapping up in the next minute. On the next two slides, I just wanted to give you a nice idea, sample of few areas of research that we're working on. Effective business cycle on economic conditions of immigrants, relationship between business cycle and the demand for immigrants. So all of this is very important as we work on our levels planning and the resumption of our work. The prevalence of immigrants and TRs and temporary residents in essential sectors, comparative health outcomes, and the list goes on. So just to wrap it up, so work continues to respond to the challenges and overcome the immediate issues, and work on scenario development and planning is underway. We will also use the situation to leverage opportunities to innovate and transform how we do our business, further digitization of our business, and we'll leverage opportunities to strengthen international cooperation, collaboration, including on research. All this will need to be very clearly communicated, as it will lead to shifting priorities and departmental plans. And with that, I will pass it back to Jane, the moderator. J'espère que je suis restée dans la 15 minutes. Merci beaucoup.
Well, so much, Mickey. That was really interesting, and I really think it set a nice tone for the presentations which are going to follow, because you highlight some key areas of study and research and what we need to know, especially when it comes to newcomers, temporary residents, established immigrants, and how they cope compared to Canadian-born. So I'm pleased to present the next presenter, Christian Bork, Executive Vice President, Léger Marketing. Christian?
Yes, hi. Premièrement, merci beaucoup. Merci de m'accueillir aujourd'hui. Merci en particulier au comité organisateur d'avoir pensé à moi comme un des présentateurs. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Jack Jedwab of the Association for Advanced Studies. Jack and I and Léger and ACS have been working together now for 16 years, and throughout this COVID crisis, this has been our greatest endeavor ever together as organizations, and I want to thank him again for the opportunity that we've had to actually share our thoughts and participate in research together. I will share my screen now, and then you should be able to see it in a second. All right, and put that in presentation format. So I will focus on certain very specific elements of the research that we have done together over the past 6 weeks throughout this crisis. But before that, just to let you know, both Léger and ACS together, we started this research process on March 11th. It's 6 weeks ago, but sounds like forever now. And in total, we've collected data with over 17,000 people on COVID specifically. 10,500 Canadians have been sampled over the past 6 weeks. On top of that, we have comparative data with now over 4,000 Americans who answered our surveys as well. 2,500 immigrants into Canada were sampled throughout the crisis too, and we've just started now. We're starting field today with an extra sample of 500 Indigenous peoples in Canada, so that we also have data and comparative data on how Indigenous peoples are actually living this crisis right now. So a little bit of what I'll be sharing today is largely focusing on comparisons between Americans, Canadians, and immigrants into Canada on one specific element. And it's already been mentioned earlier today in the different talks that we have already heard, but this issue of public trust and compliance when it comes to actually doing what governments are asking us to do. Is there a relationship? What's the nature of that relationship? And is it different, or is it? Are we living it in a different way if we're a sort of born Canadian versus an immigrant versus a newcomer into Canada? So I'll focus on just on those aspects, or that aspect of the data that we have, and I'll let Jack a little bit later on talk to you about other aspects of the data we've collected and how it is relevant to what we're doing here today. When we actually look at that relationship between public trust and compliance, I mean, there's a whole history of the impact of trust in your neighbor, trust in your institutions, and trust in one another, and how it impacts how we basically and collectively just basically go by the laws of the land and basically behave socially. And we wanted to figure out if this crisis was any different. The higher the public trust, the higher the compliance to measures put in place by governments across Canada, whether it's federal, provincial, or even municipal. Ce qu'on voulait vraiment mesurer, un des éléments qu'on voulait mesurer, c'est le lien qu'il y a entre la confiance que les gens ont envers eux-mêmes, envers leurs voisins et envers leurs institutions, et jusqu'à quel point ceci va avoir un impact sur leur compliance envers les mesures mises en place par les différents gouvernements. L'hypothèse étant, plus on a confiance envers nos institutions et envers les autres, plus on va avoir tendance à se conformer aux directives de la part de nos gouvernements. Quand on regarde la relation au niveau statistique, il y a une corrélation élevée entre les deux. When we look at the actual data, there's a high correlation between level of public trust and also compliance. But what I'll show you now is basically some of the key results from our research. Nous posons une question depuis les dernières semaines, à savoir jusqu'à quel point les gens ont confiance envers les différentes personnes ou les différentes organisations suivantes. What you have on screen is basically those who say they trust these different individuals or institutions, and you have the comparative between the immigrant population in Canada, non-immigrant Canadians, and then you also have the comparative to the US sample that we've been doing at the same time. So levels of trust, if you look at them systematically, are higher for Canadians compared to Americans. We know from past data and from global data, Canada tends to be a higher trust country. The US tends to be a lower trust country on all variables that we've looked at. The only difference being, and it's not on screen here, but the only group where Americans have higher trust than Canadians is when we ask about trust in religious leaders. Outside of that, Canadians display a higher level of trust compared to Americans. And if you look at the different categories we have here, you'll see that there are very little difference between immigrants into Canada and non-immigrants in Canada. Trust in healthcare professionals is in the 90s, extremely high, cannot go higher. Trust in public health officials is extremely high for both immigrant and non-immigrant, significantly higher than what we have in the US. When we ask about Theresa Tam, because of course we've seen her in advertising across Canada, the level of trust appears to be higher among non-immigrant, but if you look at the data, there's only a slightly higher proportion of recent immigrants into Canada who say they do not know Theresa Tam yet. So it's more a difference of awareness than a difference in trust altogether. Trust in the WHO is high in Canada, certainly higher than in the US. Trust in the banks, and trust in even the Prime Minister of Canada as a figurehead of our federal institutions is significantly higher among the immigrant population compared to non-immigrants. But again, that level of trust in the Prime Minister is high across the country. the trust in elected officials is even higher among immigrants compared to non-immigrants into Canada, and again, significantly higher than in the States. Same for media, and same for, do you trust your neighbors? We see again that that trust level is higher here compared to the States, even though the gap is not as wide. So we've seen throughout this that there's a high level of public trust in Canada, certainly higher than the United States. And when we compare immigrants to non-immigrants, the difference is, if they exist, immigrants into Canada tend to display higher levels of social trust altogether. So how does that translate into how we feel about our institutions? And basically, do we comply with the public measures that have been put in place? One thing that has been striking, and coming into this crisis, last 25 years, if you look at everything that's been written about political participation in Western countries, is growing cynicism, public disengagement with their community, with their nation, and with their institutions, and people basically a loss of belief and a loss of trust in democratic institutions altogether in the West. However, if we look at the data, I've been stricken by just how high satisfaction with the performance of our political leaders has been. If you look at overall, when we say, are you satisfied with the work that the Government of Canada has been doing over the course of this crisis, we're registering satisfaction levels that are borderline close to 80%. The same goes for provincial governments, and the same go for municipal governments. When faced with this crisis, Canadians basically rallied behind their institutions. Quand on regarde globalement, si on évalue la satisfaction envers la performance de nos gouvernements, les scores sont du jamais vu. I do not remember a time where we would have had satisfaction scores in the 80s for any government, if you go back in time. If we break that down, you'll see that throughout Canada, regardless of region, regardless of age, satisfaction with the performance of the federal government is extremely high, even better with provincial governments, even and close to 72% as well for municipal governments. So the fact that we've expressed that we have a higher level of trust, that we refer and are satisfied with the performance of our governments right now, will this reward us in having sort of better compliance to the measures put in place? You have here the performance of provincial leaders. 92% of Quebecers say they're satisfied with the work done by the Legault government. 82% of Ontario residents say they are satisfied with the work of the Doug Ford government. If I would have asked you 6 weeks ago, do you think that satisfaction score for Doug Ford will be in the 80s soon? Nobody would have bet against me, even though I'm not a betting man. So these high levels of satisfaction are also a reflection of our high level of trust. Now, again, if we compare immigrant population into Canada, non-immigrants and US citizens, look at the high level of trust, again, shining in terms of satisfaction that we express with our governments. 83% of immigrants into Canada say they're satisfied with the performance of our federal government. It's 75% among non-immigrant Canadians. And look at what we see in the United States. I will refrain from commenting on that one. What about provincial governments compared to state governments? Again, very high levels of satisfaction between immigrant and non-immigrant Canadians compared to US citizens, the same for municipal governments. This again tells us, or suggests anyways, that we should expect better compliance from Canadians compared to our southern neighbor, unfortunately. We even had a question 2 weeks ago, which was, to summarize, would you be a snitch? Would you report people to your local authorities if you saw that they were actually behaving in a way that goes against the measures put in place by governments? Canadians, 37% of Canadians said, yeah, I would not hesitate to snitch on a neighbor or somebody I see on the street, compared to 31% who say they would not. This again was a figure we did not expect. And that again is even higher among immigrant Canadians at 42% compared to 36% among non-immigrant Canadians, and again compares to 25% among US citizens. So the likelihood to trust your authorities to the point that you would actually snitch on a neighbor is actually sort of a surprising figure to a lot of us. Now, how does this transpose into compliance to the measures that have been put in place by our different levels of government? First and foremost, Canadians believe, or anyways, they say they find it fairly easy to comply with the measures that have been put in place. This figure is 78% for Canadians. It varies a little bit across regions of the country, but generally it's actually fairly high for all subgroups. We see that there is a bit of a decline in that data when we look at particularly vulnerable populations. The lower the income, the tougher this gets, for obvious reasons, of course. You do maybe not have the luxury of being able to work from home as some of the more privileged Canadians have, and so on and so forth. We all understand that dynamic. But generally, Canadians believe anyways that they find it easy enough to do what they've been asked to do. And if you look at immigrant perspectives compared to non-immigrant into Canada, very similar figures, while US citizens apparently find it a little bit easier than us Canadians. However, that doesn't say much about their actual compliance. In the survey we've been asking for the past 6 weeks, do you practice social distancing to the best of your ability? Of course, if somebody does not follow those little arrows on the aisles of your supermarket, somebody may be in your face that you did not expect. But Canadians, 98% of Canadians say, yes, I've been practicing social distancing. 98% say, yes, I've been keeping a safe distance. 94% say they wash their hands more frequently than they would have. 94% say they use their elbow. And we've heard about these public safety measures now for the last few weeks. 93% say they've stopped going out except for necessities. The mask is not necessarily a measure that we will look at forward, but anyways, 32% say they are not wearing a mask. And only 15% say, I've kept on visiting my family and friends, even though that's sort of ill-advised right now. If you look at the levels of compliance, here we see that there's barely a difference on some of the indicators between immigrant and non-immigrant populations in Canada. But even though there is a slight difference that is statistically significant, I mean, it is barely there. At 97% among immigrant Canadians compared to 99% of non-immigrant, that's barely a difference. It may be statistically significant, but it is, when you look at it, insignificant in terms of how we interpret the data. And our scores are better than US citizens. Our scores, when it comes to keeping a safe distance, are almost identical between immigrant and non-immigrant populations, and better than what we see in the States. Stop going out except for necessities, no difference between immigrant and non-immigrant Canadians, and a better score than what we see in the States. Same goes for washing your hands, using your elbow, and where there is a significant difference is on wearing the mask. But we know immigrant populations into Canada are more likely to wear the mask. But culturally, for a lot of immigrants in Canada, wearing a mask is nothing out of the usual if they believe it may put others at risk. And again, better scores among Canadians, immigrant or non-immigrant, when it comes to refraining from visiting friends and family. Now, we know that maybe this higher trust in our institutions translates into higher compliance when we compare Canadians, immigrant or non-immigrant, to US citizens, and partly explains why Canada has had slightly better luck in terms of reducing the number of casualties due to COVID right now. When we push this even further, what we've done is we've calculated the percentage of Canadians who are non-compliant on one or more of the measures that have been put in place. And what we find at the bottom is that 27% of Canadians have been non-compliant on one or the other of the basic measures that have been put in place by governments right now. So basically 1 in 4. We're not always able to keep a safe distance. Some of us may have visited friends or family even though we were not supposed to, etc., etc. When we compare immigrant to non-immigrant populations in Canada, no significant difference. So, but again, if you look at US citizens, there the level of non-compliance is actually almost double than what we find in Canada. The only group where we see that there is a significant difference when we look at Canadian data are recent immigrants into the country, those basically who have been in Canada for less than 5 years. But again, if you look at the data for that population, it also relates to what we see in the data as well. is the more you tend to be vulnerable socioeconomically, the less you tend to be able to be disciplined across the whole spectrum of measures put in place by our different levels of government. But again, this is basically out of necessity and out of or lack of capacity or options to actually be better compliant. But again, even with recent immigrants, that level of non-compliance is a lot lower than what we see, for example, in the United States of America. So again, the relationship between trust and how good we believe our institutions are performing in this crisis is having an impact on our compliance with measures put in place by our different levels of government. What does it mean for the future of this crisis? We've been asking this question now for a number of weeks, is do you feel that the worst of the crisis is behind us, the worst, or we are living right now the worst of the crisis, or the worst of this crisis is yet to come? And when we compare immigrant to non-immigrant populations in Canada, we see that the levels of optimism or pessimism are largely the same, and that public opinion in Canada does not vary depending on if you're looking at immigrant or non-immigrant populations. While we see that in the United States, they tend to be somewhat more optimistic about the near future of this crisis. I will leave it at this for now. I wanted to stay within our 15 minutes. Mais en gros, ce qu'on voulait mesurer à travers un des éléments qu'on voulait mesurer, Jack va parler à d'autres de certains autres éléments aussi importants, était de regarder le lien entre la confiance envers nos institutions et envers nous-mêmes et l'impact que ça pourrait avoir sur notre niveau de discipline à respecter les mesures mises en place par les différents niveaux de gouvernement. Et ce qu'on s'aperçoit, c'est qu'il y a effectivement un lien statistique et que le fait d'être un immigrant ou un non-immigrant au Canada a très, très peu d'impact sur notre capacité et notre volonté à respecter les mesures de protection qui existent en ce moment au Canada. Donc, je vais maintenant retourner la parole à notre animatrice et merci encore une fois de m'avoir donné la possibilité de vous parler aujourd'hui durant cette conférence.
Merci, Christian. I think very, very interesting. I've been following your results for a number of weeks now, and I'm always struck by some of the differences between Canada and US, and you've noted those, and some of the regional and gender and age differences. So really, really interesting. And I think Jack's going to pick up a little bit more on the immigrant results. So the next presenter is Marc Lachance, and he's the acting Director General of Health, Justice, Diversity and Population Branch at Statistics Canada. So I believe Marc is going to talk now about some of the Stats Canada new data. Thank you.
Parfait, merci beaucoup, bonjour. I hope you can hear me well. Là, j'aimerais remercier en premier l'association d'avoir invité Statistique Canada à venir présenter. Ce matin, vous avez entendu le chef statisticien. So this morning, you heard the chief statisticians talking about Statistics Canada's commitments to work together with the associations, with many of you that is into the data ecosystems, to be able to bring data information about how we want to better understand the situations of the pandemic. My presentations today, I'm just going to go to I'm going to try to do that right now. Hopefully that will work well. Share content screen. I apologize. So hopefully you can see my presentation. So as you know, the immigrant populations maybe represent about 22% of the populations, and overall, as you know, the life experience of those living that came from outside of Canada may have different life experiences in the way that they may probably react or have a different perspective of the way that they are living the current conditions. Just the previous presentations before, we heard our speakers talking about some of the major differences in the way that people or immigrant populations are doing or reacting to the pandemics. But part of my presentations right now at the beginning, what I want to be able to present to you is a little bit of a context or information about the share of the immigrant populations before the pandemics. And I think that's important to understand how our immigrant population will react. We have to understand a little bit better, what is the share of the populations, and try to understand how they're going to maybe possibly impact through the pandemics. So as you know, like the slide that you see front of you right now shows basically the trends of the permanent residents, foreign worker, international students, and asylum claimants over time. And you can see that in the last few years, there was quite of a higher number of increase of each of those categories. You can even see that the international students, going in much higher than the permanent residents. So as we are moving towards 2020, during the beginning of the pandemic, we can all expect that those trends will probably be impacted. J'aimerais peut-être prendre juste l'occasion ici de dire que la présentation va être principalement en anglais, mais comme vous avez vu sur la présentation en ce moment, on a essayé de mettre toutes les diapos de façon bilingue. Mais vous pouvez poser vos questions dans une langue ou l'autre. So next slide. So on that slide, the graph illustrates the share. On this one, we want to be able to illustrate to the extent that the share of immigrants in different industries. So you can see that the share of immigrants in the healthcare and social assistance industry and several other industries have a significant share of immigrants, including food and accommodation in 2016. For example, for temporary foreign worker, 14% in agriculture, 20% in crop production, 3% in food manufacturing, and 3% in professional, scientific, and technical services. Also worth noting is that the share of non-permanent residents may not be reflective of the annual share due to social nature of their state. A few weeks ago, Statistics Canada released an infographics that I invite you to go see on our website called the COVID-19 disruption in agriculture on temporary foreign workers. So it was a really nice visual of to extents that the agriculture sector may be impacted by COVID by looking at backwards how many of the foreign workers were involved into the agricultural sector. Here in this slide is coming from one of our data set called the IMDb, the Longitudinal Immigration Database. And this one is an important data set, and it's going to be an important data set to follow as we're moving through the pandemic. This one only show a glimpse of the earnings of immigrant populations from 2005 to 2014. It's a cohort analysis. The reason we wanted to show this slide to you is that, as you know, this pandemic will probably have, as we know, have an impact on the economy, and we don't know to which extent that will have an impact on the overall populations. But we know that past experience, if we look at the 2008-2009 recessions, we know that some populations, some subpopulations of our immigrant population, specifically the refugees, may potentially have a higher impact on their earnings. If we look at the 2008 and 2009 recessions, if we look at the trends of earnings, we can see that some categories, especially the privately sponsored refugees and the government assisted refugees, took almost like 2 to 3 years before we were to catch up their earnings. So the only reason I mentioned this graph is that as we're moving along to the pandemic and past, we will have to really understand a bit better the impact of of how much that COVID-19 could have an impact on the earnings and social economic outcomes of our participants. The next two slides is basically new information. As the Chief of Statistics mentioned at the beginning of this presentations, we have done, Statistics Canada responded to undertake a series of new data collections. And in fact, we started a new web panel survey a few weeks ago. And so about 2 weeks ago, we released the first result, but today we are making available the first glimpse, it's just like a little teaser of how this information could be broken down by immigrant and Canadian-born populations. The web panel survey is about 4,000 respondents, 46,000 respondents, does allow us to break down that subpopulations. Unfortunately, the sample size does not allow us to go a little bit further. And I understand that there's a need sometimes to understand a bit better how the experience of the newcomers specifically may differ from the rest of the immigrant populations. Having said that, the web panel survey will provide a rich source of information on how our immigrant population can fare differently on some of the aspects. So this is a panel survey. So, and today I can also mention that in complementing to this presentation, Statistics Canada released a new article series on our website that basically provide a bit of narratives and contextual information around this new data that I'm presenting right now. So if we turn to that slide specifically, this slide is about the immigrants. Basically what we're saying is that immigrants are more concerned about the economic situation than Canadian-borns. And you can see by that graph here that the immigrant populations did see for significantly a much major impact that could have on the economic situations and moderate impact than the Canadian-born. On the next slides, and where we want to say here is that also immigrants have greater concerns about their own health and the health of their families. And similarly to other Canadians, as you can see here in this graph specifically, is that you can see that immigrants in pretty much all aspects, they do feel that they are concerned about their own health, about 50%, compared to about a third of the Canadian-born. Same thing with member of the households, they're very concerned about the health of their member household, about 68% in relation to 50% of the rest of the populations. And you can see on that graph here that even on the overall health system, they are very or extremely concerned. So that shows a bit of a glimpse of what the web panel survey will be able to provide. And the next slide is that they also have, what we found is that the immigrants also have greater concerns about the social consequences of what the pandemic, the COVID-19 could have on them. And here you see here on the bottom of the graph is that you have different aspect or perspective. And we know that from previous research that shown that although immigrants have different social networks than Canadian-born, we know that some categories of immigrants may also be more sensitive to certain social risks, like civil disorder and ability to support each other. And the web panel, in fact, has demonstrated that. And you can see here in this graph the large gap between the perceptions of how immigrant populations are extremely or very concerned about some of the impact around social disorder, maintaining social ties. You can see the ability to cooperate to support another during the crisis. You can see that in all those categories, ability to cooperate to support another fact of the crisis, family stress, another confinement. You can see that the gap between the two subpopulations. So this is today we also release to Statistics Canada website. I mentioned before an article series where we have also some other information. So if you go to our website, there's also some new information that's been reported. So from that web panel, we can also say that the immigrant men are more likely to report that the crisis will have an impact on their finances. We know that recent research have shown the labor market outcomes immigrants improve in recent years. And the question is that are immigrants are likely to report a high unit level of concerns about their personal economic situation in the context of pandemics. And actually the result did show that immigrants were not necessarily more likely in the Canadian-born to believe, but they also lose their job as a result of the pandemic. So if you go to our website, you may be able to see a bit more of the results that we released today. So in that slide, just to end my presentations, is that we're showing here a little bit some of the new informations that are available to the COVID-19 situations. We have started some new panel surveys. You heard the statisticians talking about the new crowdsourcing data collections that we started. In fact, I will invite you to promote. There's one that has started a few days ago, last week. It's about mental health, in which we also ask questions on other aspects. And we welcome Canadians to answer that questionnaire. The first one we did had over 200,000 respondents. So we want to thank all the Canadians to have responded to that crowdsourcing panel. There was some questions into the chat room whether or not Statistics Canada will allow the disaggregations of data into different subpopulation group, immigrant, visible minorities, and other groups. So as we are moving along Statistics Canada, where the data sets or the survey does allow it, we will allow the disaggregation. We will add questions that will allow us to disaggregate further this information where the survey does allow it. We also in our website provided a new web page where almost like in a very almost like every single day or so, we have new data, new analysis are being disseminated that specifically provide a glimpse or insight of how the situation is evolving around the pandemic from a Canadian perspective. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. You were really on time. That's great too. But I think you can see, everybody participating today can see the richness of information that is coming out in a really timely way on many aspects of the situation, and the ability to look at immigrants and see how they are feeling and coping some of their differences with Canadian-born. So, and I think too, you're making some of this information more accessible. You're getting a public use microdata file out, because I know a lot of the those researchers out there will want to know, this is great information, but how do we get access to that? And maybe we can talk about that. So the next presenter needs no introduction, Jack Jedwab, President and CEO of Association of Canadian Studies in Metropolis. So over to you, Jack.
Thanks very much, Jane. They're just going to put up the PowerPoint as I'm speaking here. Let me thank everyone else again, my fellow panelists, and je vais aller assez vite à cause du temps qui presse pour permettre des questions. Je m'excuse encore pour la question de traduction. On a engagé des traducteurs, traductrices pour fournir la traduction, mais malheureusement, juste avant le début, il y avait un problème technique et il fallait qu'on agisse sans la traduction, mais on va corriger le tir lors de la prochaine conférence. Aussi, permettez-moi, let me also begin very quickly, and I'm going to do this quickly for the sake of allowing questions and comments, as I said, to thank my research team, led by the research director, Paul Hawley, and also special thanks to Ang Nguyen. Today's Ang's last day. She's going on maternity leave, and I want to express our appreciation for all the hard work she's done in helping us to pull all the research together. So with that said, I'm going to build a bit on what Marc Lachance said and what Christian said as well, and just present very briefly some of the data we've been able to generate with the distinctions between recent immigrants, 5 years or less, established immigrants, which we're calling 5 years or more in this case, and the non-immigrants. Again, unlike Statistics Canada, our sample sizes are not as large as the crowdsourcing or web surveys, but we're operating with more limited samples, but there were oversamples of immigrants and newcomers in the surveys that Leger has conducted with us, and so we'll be able to share that. But keep in mind the cautions around the sample sizes, and take these as snapshots, but very important snapshots that give us insight into things that we'll need to think about going forward by way of determining what our research needs are, and the importance of providing an evidence base to decisions and resource allocation and programming policies, etc., as we attempt to move through this unprecedented crisis and develop collective strategies to ensure that all Canadians are re-engaged in society as we go forward. So go forward. Thank you. So here's the first one. This is the extent to which people are afraid of contracting the virus, and you can see that as we evolve from March 17th to April 17th over the 4 waves of survey work that we did, that there isn't much distinction in terms of the fear of contracting the virus, at least between the immigrants themselves, but is a distinction between immigrants and non-immigrants. That's at about 10 points, not insignificant when comparing immigrants collectively with non-immigrants. Next. So as regards 4 questions that we asked around the various economic challenges that Canadians are encountering as distinguished on the basis of time of arrival, those persons that have been in Canada for less than 5 years, if you look at the bottom row of the slide, are saying 48% are encountering a greater difficulty in, are encountering a negative impact in meeting their financial obligations, the example being paying bills, considerably greater than those immigrants that are have been in Canada 5 years or more, and non-immigrants at 24%. It's almost double in terms of the situation that newcomers report that they're encountering with respect to a very key dimension of the crisis from an economic standpoint. Next. Similar again, capacity to pay mortgage or rent. Those immigrants in Canada that have been here for less than 5 years, according to, again, the bottom row of this particular slide, it's, again, more than double in terms of the extent to which they report encountering a negative impact in their ability to pay rent or mortgage payments, etc. Similar pattern. Next, sorry. Similarly, with respect to questions about the ability to assist family members, once again, very substantial gaps between newcomers, more established immigrants, and non-immigrants, upwards of 25 points in terms of the gap you're seeing between those people less than 5 years in Canada and non-immigrants. So to build a bit on what Marc was saying earlier, juste pour ajouter à ce que Marc a dit tantôt, en termes de la distinction entre immigrants et non-immigrants, on voit qu'il y a déjà eu dans la présentation des données de Statistique Canada qui sont basées sur un échantillonnage beaucoup plus important que la nôtre, mais quand même, on voit qu'il y a un différentiel important entre les personnes qui sont arrivées récemment versus ceux qui sont au Canada 5 ans pour 5 ans et plus. Next. So this is just a roll-up, the attempt to construct, if you like, an economic vulnerability index based on the the 3 indicators that I referred to in the previous slides. And what you can see in the bar chart, which I think offers a nice illustration of the difference in terms of the overall negative impact on those 3 dimensions of economic vulnerability, that it's hit the newcomers to a substantially greater extent than it has hit those other groups. But again, hit people here 5 years or more greater than it's hit non-immigrants. And even with controls in place that we've put in to try to compare something that is more apples to apples, those gaps are still quite substantial between those categories of Canadians. Now, let me just say very quickly that some people may observe that there were, and will certainly remark that these gaps existed, these inequities existed prior to COVID. And so this is just a reflection of the inequities that existed prior to COVID. Well, that would be inaccurate, because what this reflects is a potential multiplier effect of the gaps that existed prior to COVID, right? Because we're asking people about the effects of COVID. So it takes into consideration that the inequities that existed previously that needed correction very likely will find an even wider range in the current period, and very probably in the post-COVID period that we'll need to address. Next. This is on issues of life stress, and you could see there's some gaps between if you look at the second column, the people here less than 5 years, there are some gaps in terms of issues of sadness. We see a gap in terms of difficulty sleeping. We see a gap between the newcomers and those immigrants 5 years or more. Overall, despite the economic vulnerabilities, the gaps, while significant, might not be as substantial as some assume. Though again, even on some of these dimensions, irritability, mood swings, etc., there are pronounced gaps. Il y a quand même des écarts assez importants. Il y a, je peux vous assurer, pour avoir regardé les données, des importantes corrélations entre le degré auquel les gens font face de manière plus inéquitable des difficultés économiques et les questions d'anxiété et tristesse et autres dimensions de défis en matière de santé mentale. Next. So again, this is just a roll-up of those indicators that I presented earlier, and as you can see, when we do that, once again, those people in Canada 5 years or less are facing more significant challenges in terms of well-being or life stress, however one wishes to label the roll-up of those particular indicators, than are people in Canada 5 years or more, or non-immigrants. Next. Right, so just one example of something from a recent survey. Again, in the April 24th to 26th survey, we didn't have sufficient numbers of oversampled newcomers to be able to draw strong conclusions. But one of the things I thought was noteworthy was with respect to a series of measures in the last survey on comfort or discomfort with 12 particular issues in thinking about re-engagement in public life. One area where there was a high rate of discomfort was the use of public transit. Now, anyone who is residing in one of our larger cities probably will feel, in terms of social distancing, particularly challenged at the prospect of using public transit to get to work. I think it's fair to say, and the data shows this, that public transit users are disproportionately more including those people who are newcomers, immigrants generally, even though they're used obviously by the entire population. But you'll find in big cities disproportionate rates of use of public transit. So one of the paradoxes I noted in the re-entry questions is that a lot of people in Montreal and other cities are ready to go back to work or want to go back to work, but a majority of them are uncomfortable using public transit. So this creates a real issue around the sort of interest in going back to work or the desire to do so, but how one gets there is an issue that merits attention. Next. And again, newcomers find it difficult to social distance. Total difficulty is higher in terms of not the extent to which people are social distancing, but the extent to which they're finding it difficult to do so. Everyone, as Christian pointed out before, seems to indicate they are social distancing. I actually don't believe that, but you know, that's another question altogether. But there's a high degree of difficulty in terms of the extent to which people are encountering, or rather able to social distance. La capacité de faire la distanciation sociale est plus élevée selon nos enquêtes, notamment pour les gens qui sont au Canada depuis moins, c'est-à-dire au Canada pour moins de 5 ans. Et c'est pourquoi je fais le lien avec le diapositive précédent en termes d'utilisation du transport public, où le défi de faire la distanciation sociale est assez élevé. Alors, c'est une chose, je crois, à tenir en compte quand on fait la planification, parce que la distanciation sociale est considérée une des mesures clés afin de combattre le virus. Next. So, go ahead. Wearing protective masks, so Christian pointed out that immigrants in general, newcomers more specifically, are more inclined to wear protective masks, although we've seen a bit of a narrowing of the gap between immigrants that are more recent arrivals and those 5 years or more, but non-immigrants are less likely to wear protective masks. So that's another issue that will, I think, have a bearing on the social context in terms of the fight against the virus. Next. Go ahead, next, because I want to. Okay, so finally, I did have another slide which somehow seemed to have escaped the PowerPoint, but it involved an intersection between visible minority status and immigrant status. And what you would have seen in that slide is that those people who are immigrants that identify as visible minority are a lot more hard hit by the economic consequences and the stress issues than those people who are immigrants that do not identify as visible minorities. And there's also a gender dimension as well, in terms of the extent to which men or women are respectively feeling the social or life stress dimensions of the crisis. So the intersectionality, I would argue, is an extremely important dimension of things that we need to explore. And we need to have the data in order to do that if we're going to all move forward and work our way through this particular crisis. We need to be able to understand where there's vulnerabilities in our society, and it's with the evidence base that we can best do that, so that we can apply the proper programs and policies in order to move us into whatever that new normal looks like together, and not see the expansion of inequity. So I wanted to close on this point, on this question. Are we applying a diversity lens to measuring the impacts of COVID-19? That's a key question that we need to ask. My sort of experience with government and in general, which has been a generally positive experience, has been one where we do apply that diversity lens to understanding social and economic phenomenon and deal with them effectively. And I'm glad to see that Statistics Canada and Marc a vraiment pris de l'avance, a vraiment montré un leadership en termes de nous aider à comprendre la situation à travers cette optique de la diversité. Il faut qu'on va plus loin et il faut que les ressources soient présentes afin de nous permettre de dégager où les situations de vulnérabilité sont des défis plus importants à adresser. Je veux aussi en conclure que 2021 va faire 50 ans de notre politique de multiculturalisme au Canada. J'espère que d'ici un an, nous serons tous en mesure de célébrer notre diversité qui a fait un apport très important à notre société. Et nous serons en mesure de la faire avec tous les outils nécessaires afin d'assurer une équité pour l'ensemble de la population. So I just wanted to quickly say that next year, I hope, in 2021, which will mark the 50th anniversary of Canadian multiculturalism, we'll all be able to celebrate our diversity together. We'll be addressing the challenges associated with our diversity and ensure also that our Indigenous populations and our official language minorities are all able to work through this crisis together with all the means that we have at our disposal and have used as effectively as we can as a society as we go forward through this crisis. And let me again reiterate, I want to wish everyone good health. Please stay safe. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you. I think we now have, thank you, that was great. You can see the richness of this information, and I can see from the questions how interested you are in the results and getting certainly access to the data, but to the presentations today. So super interesting stuff and lots of questions. So I think I have, and I think the panel have, we may probably have about 10, maybe 15 minutes if we push it, but 10 minutes. So I've been watching the comments, and I'm going to group them. So I'm just going to go through sort of groups of questions and then open it up to the entire panel to answer. I think that's probably the best way. I know there were some very, very specific questions about Christian, did you do this? And Jack and Mark and Mike, but I think those you can maybe answer offline. But there seems to be, so I'm just going to go through what I see as the different kinds of topics, and then I'll let the panel address them. One is around, is this a general population sample, especially these people, Stats Canada and Leger and Jack, who've been working with survey data. How representative are the results for immigrants? Were there special provisions made, multiple languages, if there were English or French skill difficulty levels in answering, what were the provisions made? So I think that's really about the conduct of the survey, and perhaps some can answer about, I think you did a bit of oversampling of immigrants. So how representative, and how did you address the questions to different levels of literacy among immigrants? Then I think the second tranche of questions is really around that disaggregation of the immigrant population. So I touched on recent immigrants, but I see a lot of questions about, what about temporary residents? Are you going to have more data or more plans to get data on the undocumented population, international students, refugees, whether they're privately sponsored or government sponsored? So really digging down into that data, and are there plans? I don't know, maybe Mike could talk about her plans in terms of doing research on these different groups as well. The one that I struck, and I really like one question which we have been talking about in the social impacts network as we've seen this data, is the biases, especially when we're talking about some of the public health behaviors, and people would get really high, yes, 98%, almost 100% of those answering these surveys are saying they're doing social distancing, which may be a little bit different than what individually you're seeing out there. So how much are the results affected by social desirability, de ce qu'on fait versus de ce qu'on fait vraiment? So maybe if you could talk about that. Certainly, and then I'll just end, another area is the level of disaggregation. There's certainly been a lot of discussion in the media, and you see it coming out of the States about differences, in the UK as well, differences by minority groups, racially disaggregated groups, racialized groups, or persons with disability. That was another one that came up. So again, so I kind of laid out 4 different areas. So I'm just going to turn it over to the panel. Maybe we'll start with Mike first, and we'll just go through the order of presentation. If you can try and address, to some extent, these questions and concerns that participants have been raising in the question and answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks to everyone online for the questions. I've been trying to keep track of them, but they're going faster than I can follow. What I would like to say, first of all, is over the past few years, and my colleague from Statistics Canada will be able to provide additional information here. We have done a huge amount of work in terms of linking databases. So we have our immigration database, the IMDb that Mark referred to, but we also have, we are able to link to the labor, the workforce survey. We're able now to link to the, what we call the iCare database. So we have more and more cross linkages of data, which of course leads to a richer variety of disaggregation and looking at data that we can do. So yes, in certain instances, not consistently maybe, but we have looked, we are able to look at the difference between privately sponsored refugees and government assistant refugees. For example, when we did the massive survey of the Syrian population, we were able to disaggregate between the different groups, and we can do that. We're not always able to do that consistently, but we do that where we can, because of course the deeper you drill down, the more meaningful the data are. Also, someone asked a question about students. So we were, I think I mentioned this, we are about to launch a qualitative research project on how students, international students, are faring. And we will be weaving in some COVID-19 questions, and we will be drilling down quite specifically. We're starting to use also more and more surveys, and surveys allow you to drill deeper and to ask questions, and we've used that tool quite successfully. Maybe just as there were quite a few questions about our ability to continue processing and whether we're still, so we are still at work. But there are impacts, obviously. Not everyone is able to work remotely. It's amazing, again, how many people are able to work remotely, but not everyone is able to work remotely. And of course, we're heavily dependent on our partners. If the visa application centers overseas are not functioning, then we're not getting the biometric data, we're not getting the applications that they would be processing for us overseas. So there's lots of dependencies, and I cannot say that there's no impact, but we have been able to continue processing. And for example, those who are ready to land and who are in Canada, we're able to look at our database and we are able to focus in on them because they're already here. They don't have to make an international trip to come to Canada, because of course that is pretty much ground to hold. So maybe in the interest of time, Jane, I'll leave it at this for now.
Thank you, because I think you certainly addressed some of those very specific questions about international students and refugees, so that's great. Christiane, maybe you can kind of address some of the questions that people have had about representation, and what did you do with addressing immigrants, and maybe some of the bias that you see in the surveys.
Yeah, to address the first point, of course, there's some limitations to the work that we've been able to do with Leger and ACS are co-funding this, so we've got limited means in the particular context to be able to do that. So the immigrants that have answered the survey were able to answer the survey in either English or French. So of course that introduces a limitation if somebody is not able to read and then respond to questions in either of the official languages, we were not able to survey them at this time. Of course, it would be awesome. It would be the best if we could do the sort of a multilingual telephone study to try to get at that element of bias. But in the interest of time and with the means available to us, that wasn't possible. So that's one area where there's a set of questions that were directed to that here on as well. The second element that I want to address is the element of social desirability. And what I think we measured was not social desirability, but something else. These questionnaires were all self-administered, so you're being socially desirable to yourself because you're alone in front of a screen. So I think what may be the concern here is when we ask people, have you been social distancing? And they basically are answering yes. And we were having this debate, Jack and I would answer yes, that I've been social distancing. But it might have happened while taking a walk outside with my daughter that somebody, their bike might have been within 2 meters of me when they actually kind of rolled by, but I've been doing it to the best of my ability. So I think what people are answering is, I've been social distancing to the best of my ability. I've been, coughing in my elbow to the best of my ability, but I might have missed out a couple of times. So again, there's sort of a bit of a limitation in terms of what we can measure in there. But I do not believe it's social desirability bias, because again, there was no interviewee interface that might have caused that. What I think is basically 98% of Canadians have been trying to be the best at it that they can. So I think that's one limitation of the research that we need to address. What's interesting though is when you ask the same questions to different populations over 5 weeks now, if there is a slight bias, it will be the same in every wave of the research and then with every population that you're surveying. So we can still assess how differences between different subgroups of the population may have an impact on what's going on. But it is right, even though we all do our best, we're not absolutely perfect at it all the time.
Sorry, good. I was on mute there. I think that really, yeah, that's a good, I really liked how you answered that social desirability, because it's come up a number of times. So I think that's really important. And we're certainly learning. I mean, I think that's what we're learning through all of this work is, what are people feeling and how are they answering some of these surveys, or how do we interpret the results, I think. So Mark, I'll just turn to you, Mark. And,
perfect. Yes. So try to be short. So so most of our survey in StatsCan, just to piggyback what my colleagues from RCC said, some of the slides presented to you, I think StatsCan has a very rich data sets, what we call the IMDb, which is a link administrative data set coming from in partnerships with RCC, and also integrated data with other data sources that StatsCan may have on income and other characteristics. And that data set will be very key in disaggregating informations by immigration classes, refugees, international students, non-permanent residents, and so on. So there will be allowed us to look at the trends, and specifically during the 2020, as we're getting data, compiled in the next few weeks and months, we're hoping that we'll be able to see, the impact that COVID may have had on those populations from a socioeconomic outcome specifically. Having said that, also the web panel survey that I presented, this one is fairly limited in terms of sample size and everything. So the only thing we could present to you with today was just a breakdown of the immigrant status. We don't have the breakdown further by immigrations. Just like our colleagues from the previous speaker had mentioned, is that there's always some bias, possible bias or risk of bias within these surveys. In StatsCan, all our surveys is done in both official languages. We rely a lot on when we do questionnaires and everything, there's always what we call qualitative testing to ensure that the questionnaire is well understood by different type of populations. The sample size for this one, it was really high. The methodology for the panel survey is respondents that have been part of the labor force survey previously. So it does include a lot of background information that will be allowed to do further analysis when we look at more as we're progressing to the pandemic. There's always when we do questionnaire design and everything, we're always looking at possible bias, how the people can interpret questions. So that's why I mentioned a bit earlier. We always try to do some testing before to understand how people understand the questions. We know that, let's want to piggyback on what I said, the social disability is always a concern each time we do questionnaire design to ensure that we have a consistent way of answering those questions and try to minimize as much as possible the impact. So I'll just leave it like this for the time being.
Great. Jack, do you want to weigh in on your views on all of these kind of groupings of questions, I think, these concerns that people have raised?
Well, I think, given the amount of time we've had to put the work out there, both ourselves with Léger and Statistics Canada, it's been rather remarkable in my estimation what we've been able to achieve. It was a real major paradigm shift for Statistics Canada. I'm not sort of speaking for Statistics Canada, but I'm quite convinced, and I'm sure Mark would agree, that going to web panels was a drastic paradigm shift for Statistics Canada, and basically we've seen through our research network of about, I guess, 40 plus people who've been really helpful in providing us with suggestions around what types of questions we should ask as the situation has evolved. And the situation's evolved quite rapidly, so some of the questions that seemed relevant 3 weeks ago were not as relevant, and we've had all kinds of suggestions and requests about oversampling, and we've tried to accommodate that to the best of our ability. It's going to be hard to get a massive survey in these circumstances. It's going to touch on all the various issues that people I note have been raising in the chat box without a massive number of people engaged with it and very substantial resources that would need to be mobilized. So those are some of the challenges that we've been facing, and I really think, and I'd like to thank everybody, including all the people who participated today, and all the comments and questions that only help us in terms of moving forward and trying to the best of our ability, put out the information that is needed in order for us to be able to respond most effectively to the wide range of situations that people are facing. Now, permettez-moi de dire, parce que le temps presse et je veux allouer le temps pour le prochain panel. I think when we'll compile everything we've done and analyze this and do whatever postmortems there are, because I think there'll be several postmortems given the way this thing is evolving. StatsCan, I think, will be more valuable than ever in providing us with the GSS on COVID-19, right? Because we're going to need something like that in order to look at this retrospectively and prospectively. And at that time, I suspect StatsCan will, be able to count on all the people who they've got that can input with expertise in order to provide the richest possible general social survey so they can look at this thing retrospectively and help map the route forward with the best available data. So that would be my answer to that.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you to we're going to end now because we're running a little bit late and we want to give time to the next panel. And I would thank, merci beaucoup à tous. I would like to thank each of the presenters for really, really interesting information. And thank you for posing the questions. So, merci, and we'll turn now to the next plenary. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much, Jane, also Mika Boss, Christian Bourque, Marc Lachance, and Jack Jedwab. That was really fascinating and so many insights. I encourage you at home watching, because we know you're at home, to go online and tweet some of this stuff out. A lot of people have been active on social media, tweeting some of the most interesting findings that were coming out of there. Our hashtags, of course, that we have are social impacts with an S, COVID-19, and COVID-19 Canada. So please spread the word. The conference is also streaming live on Facebook. Sans plus tarder, parce que oui, on est 15 minutes en retard, mais conférence c'est en ligne, c'est difficile de dire aux gens d'arrêter. C'est très bien. On va continuer avec le prochain panel, la prochaine plénière sur les défis pour les migrants à cause de COVID-19. Pour présenter cela et présider la séance, c'est Hubert Lucier qui va se joindre à nous. Hubert Lucier, Assistant Deputy Minister of Canadian Heritage. Monsieur Lucier est un fonctionnaire fédéral à la retraite qui a passé la plus grande partie de sa carrière à Patrimoine Canada. En tant que sous-ministre adjoint de ce ministère, il a fait progresser les dossiers de programmes politiques et de lois concernant la diversité, la langue et les questions de participation des citoyens. All things that affect us very much in this context. So, Hubert Lucier, welcome to the conference.
Thank you, Tasha. And as we've heard from the previous panelists, there's a huge difference on certain financial, psychological, and social impacts in the way the COVID crisis affects immigrants. So that's why right now we're going to hear from 4 panelists who are going to tell us a little bit about their view of the world. La perspective de ces 5 panélistes va être plus près du terrain. So instead of having a deluge of statistics that are quite informative, we're going to now have a perspective from the ground. And in the pursuit of catching up with time, I will start by presenting and introducing the first speaker immediately, Corinne Prince, une collègue avec laquelle j'ai travaillé dans le passé assez étroitement. She's Director General, Settlement and Integration in the Policy Branch at IRCC, Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada. Corinne, je souhaite que tu sois prête, car je te passe la parole immédiatement.
Merci beaucoup, Hubert, pour l'introduction et c'est fantastique de te voir en forme. Et merci à Jack et l'Association d'études canadiennes pour la coordination de cette discussion très importante aujourd'hui. I'd like to also quickly thank the first panel who so thoroughly demonstrated the tremendous impact that COVID-19 has had on recent immigrants and refugees. And we know from the data collected by Léger and the ACS that these vulnerable populations are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 restrictions. And this truly does underscore the need for services for the most vulnerable to continue. So to help set the context for my presentation, I want to give you a sense of what the new normal looks like. Just as all your workplaces have faced deep disruption in operations, as you heard from Deputy Tapley and Mika, IRCC has also had major changes in how we work. And since mid-March, only 2% of our workforce is physically in the office, and the rest of us are working from home. And the pace of our work has more than doubled. I characterize this as flying the airplane and repairing it all at the same time. Durant les 7 dernières semaines, notre travail régulier a continué, mais nous avons ajouté tout le travail relié au pandémique COVID. Et en même temps, nous sommes en train d'établir les services en distance. Et nos partenaires, les provinces et territoires, sont en train de gérer les mêmes enjeux que nous. Alors, notre travail collaboratif est plus important que jamais. Given my colleague Mika spoke more broadly to the work of the department, I will focus primarily on settlement and integration. And in the settlement sector, we pivoted in the very first week of the pandemic. So on March 16th, to protect the health and safety of settlement service providers and newcomers, the department asked our network of over 500 agencies to focus primarily on the provision of critical settlement and resettlement services, while encouraging online service delivery for non-critical services where possible. Self-isolation, as you can imagine, in the refugee context, has meant careful transportation for refugee families from airports to reception houses, and the 14-day self-isolation requirement has put additional housing pressure on a resettlement network that was already stressed. Refugees new to the country without a social network have meant that frontline settlement workers have been their sole providers. And I know Fairbours will speak more about this in a moment, but I just want to underscore that this situation truly is unprecedented. And as Deputy Tapley said, to complicate matters further, as the pandemic hit, IRCC was in the midst of finalizing the largest call for proposals in the history of the department. More than 700 5-year contribution agreements worth more than $4 billion with over 500 service provider organizations. And our operational colleagues in the settlement network across the country were innovated and implemented electronic signatures to ensure that the $4 billion worth of programming would be in place for the new fiscal year on April the 1st, and not compromised because of an inability to obtain signatures due to office closures. It was a huge lift, and they did succeed with flying colors. In a time of crisis, we cannot underscore the importance of communication and engagement. And I strongly feel that frequent and open communication and discussion has been essential to allowing the department to be nimble in responding to key areas of concern, and will continue to inform our response over the medium term. You know, the long-standing and mature relationship that IRCC has with both the settlement and resettlement sectors has been the reason for our collective success. Since early February, we have been engaging weekly with the National Settlement and Integration Council, which is our national body of umbrella organizations, national and international associations, and provinces and territories. And immediately following the suspension of non-essential services that I mentioned in March, we increased this engagement to 3 national calls per week to update and explain federal decisions impacting their work, and to hear from agencies on the ground to understand, to ensure that the department understands the context that they are dealing with. Minister Mendicino has also been very active in this engagement. In fact, he's held 2 calls himself in the last 4 weeks with these critical delivery partners. And what has this done? Well, it's ensured that as new federal programs are announced, and if you're like me, you can't quite keep up to the plethora of federal programming that keeps being announced by our Prime Minister daily. But it is ensuring that these new federal programs, like the Canadian Emergency Response Benefits, like the recent $350 million Emergency Community Support Fund, are really shared quickly with our settlement and resettlement agencies, and that they understand the essence of the program so that they then can inform their clients who most need the assistance. I'm happy to say as well that the details of these federal programs will also be more extensively shared via Service Canada webinars that the department is standing up for settlement agencies across the country beginning next week. So that too will be even more helpful. And to ensure that we have our ear to the ground in real time, we now have a centralized email mailbox for service providers regarding COVID-19 measures. So these lines of engagement and communication have deepened our understanding of the scale and scope of the challenges that collectively lie before us. I think it's fair to say that in this context, we have made together incredible progress, adapting our settlement programming, and I feel we're ensuring a positive outcome in these unconventional times. On the funding front, we have advised settlement agencies that there will not be any financial penalties for organizations as a result of the pandemic. So settlement agencies who are helping the most vulnerable should not be penalized at a time like this. In addition, the cost of personal protective equipment and supplies to help agencies and their staff working in person with clients are deemed eligible costs. And there are further efforts afoot as we speak to ensure that frontline workers have what they need. While some critical services can be provided virtually, other services, especially for vulnerable clients, including case management supports, require in-person program delivery. So to recognize the personal risk that frontline staff are incurring, IRCC announced an increase of up to 15% in staff wages between April 1st and June the 30th for frontline staff delivering critical in-person services. We will be looking to possibly extend that as that deadline arrives. Now, at 7 weeks into the pandemic, the department is actively working to stand up additional alternative service delivery mechanisms to provide continued service to newcomers as the pandemic continues. The most important of these include expanding online language assessments and instruction. And we've been working closely with the National Language Advisory Board, whose expertise and guidance have been critical. We're working also to replicate employment training, which will be critically important for newcomers to be ready to enter or re-enter the labor market in the recovery period. And finally, we're continuing to support our 32 resettlement agencies who are heroically continuing to receive government-assisted refugees and many personal protection cases. In closing, with extensive engagement by the department at all levels, the sector has overcome many of the immediate challenges of the COVID-19 crisis. But there is still much uncertainty about what the future holds and when the pandemic will subside. A decision to reopen our borders will also require a resumption of services by air carriers. How quickly they will be able to respond is unknown. And all of this will be critical to the department delivering on the commitments in this year's levels plan. Our minister knows how important immigration will be to the economic recovery. So he is committed to meeting our targets and working with the settlement sector to do so. As I pass la parole to Lori, I would like to leave you all with one word: resiliency. The ability to rebound and adapt to change, disruption, or adversity, and to come out of it stronger and better. I can tell you the settlement sector is resilient. And why? It's resilient because so many of its employees, the settlement workers themselves, were previously immigrants and refugees who have seen this and so much else many times before. We will be counting on their resiliency to carry us through. Merci Hubert, merci Jack, et un grand merci à tous nos fournisseurs de services, d'établissement et de rétablissement. Merci.
Thank you very much, Corinne. Can't say I'm amazed because I know how good you are, but I'm in admiration before the quantity and the quality of the work that my former colleagues, since I'm now retired, have been doing in response to the crisis. Merci infiniment, Corinne. So our next speaker is Laurie Wilkinson. She's professor and teaches at the Department of Sociology at the University of Manitoba. She specializes in immigration and refugee studies with a focus on issues related to discrimination, settlement, and health. Laurie, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much. I will try to get my screen up here. Give me a second. There we go. All right. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba and my house are both located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and also the homeland of the Métis Nations. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, and we acknowledge the harms that have been inflicted on our Indigenous relatives. So maybe many of you may not realize it, but you've heard a lot of sociology in the last couple of months. Terms like social distancing, white-collar quarantine, social determinants of health, I see that on the news quite frequently. And so I've been asked today to provide a short discussion on social determinants of health and how it might affect certain subsets of immigrants and refugees in Canada in terms of the COVID pandemic. So I'll move forward. I'm hoping to answer 3 questions today. Can we implement a social determinants of health framework to understanding the impact of the pandemic on newcomers? What is the socioeconomic impact on COVID-19 on Canada's newcomers populations? And finally, what are some considerations for safe living and work for newcomers facing such vulnerabilities? And I want to preface all of this by saying immigrants and refugees and temporary workers and international students, they are unique. They might experience these conditions differently than other Canadians, but it doesn't necessarily mean that other Canadians aren't experiencing these as well. So I'm going to start with a description of what is the social determinants of health, because I'm sure you've seen this in the news quite frequently. Many factors have an influence on health. In addition to our individual genetics and lifestyle choices, where we were born, grow, live, work, and age also have important influences on our health. Health differences can partly be explained by your genes and the choices that you make. For example, whether or not you exercise or if you drink alcohol. But there are other aspects called the social determinants of health that can also influence your health outcome, and these are largely beyond your personal control. For example, Canadians with higher incomes are healthier than those with lower incomes. This is because they have access to better food, better education, better living conditions, and all the other things that come with wealth to produce healthier outcomes in individuals. Now, global patterns of morbidity and mortality follow inequalities rooted in social, political, and economic conditions produced and reproduced by social structures, policies, and institutes. A social determinants of health approach focuses on the structural factors, aside from medical care, that are determined by the social and the economic policies that we have in our country. And Marc Lachance from Statistics Canada in the early panel shared some of these social determinants of health data. I want to talk to you through this little slide as well. So you have on the left-hand side, somebody pushing a little ball up a ramp, and the ramp is made steeper or shorter by the number of key conditions that may influence your health, right? So if you have, if you're poor, that adds more steepness to the ramp. If you have more problems finding housing, that adds more steepness to the ramp. Key to our discussion today, if you've experienced racism, that adds more slope to that ramp. The way you experience that ramp is determined by a whole bunch of factors. And I haven't listed them all here, right? Normally, if this was a class, I'd ask you all to say, well, what else am I missing on this slide? And I know I'm missing a lot on this slide, but I put a few here for your example, right? We know that there's gender differences to health, ethnicity differences to health, indigenous differences. And so all of these factors, they combine with each other in different ways to affect how a person's health outcome. And so that, in short, is what the social determinants of health is. Why do we need to be concerned as Canadians about the health of immigrants, refugees, temporary workers, international students? Well, as I think it was Mark's data showed, that if you add up all of the numbers of people who are coming to Canada, we get about 300,000 per year who are coming to Canada as permanent residents or immigrants or accepted as refugees. Then almost another 650,000 people in those other categories are coming as well, many of them who will stay in Canada. So that's a large number of people. And when we're talking about a pandemic, thinking about the livelihoods of many millions of people is very important. So how does this work in real life? So I've given you a simple example here from some research that was conducted in 2017. Well, actually, it's from this really nifty Pan-Canadian Health Inequalities tool, which I would encourage you to visit. And so this is just a table that I made from this data. And I apologize that the words on the background are so small, but basically what it shows is that there's an ethnic difference in a woman's ability to obtain mammographies in Canada. And this is something that we know. And so if you look at the lowest bars, women from South Asian and Middle Eastern countries, they're the least likely in Canada to access a mammogram compared to other racial groups. So this is a simple explanation of what could be a social determinant of health outcome. A more complex example I've gathered together from another piece of research from a group of researchers that produced a set of data on immigrant women and their access to mammographies across internationally. So we're looking at immigrant women internationally here. And what they found in their research is that amongst other things, and I could have made this table also way more complicated, but I didn't want to clutter it up, but the three top indicators of getting access to a mammogram were immigrant status, ethnic group affiliation, and did you live in a rural or an urban place. And that interaction of those experiences is not direct often, sometimes it is, but it's also mediated by a bunch of different other factors, right? So we see in the middle, the yellow boxes, pointing to income and education, immigrant status, ethnicity, and urban rural location have influence on both income and education, which in turn influence a person's ability to find good housing, which in turn informs or determines whether or not a woman can get access to a mammogram. So you can see how quickly these social determinants of health become more complicated very quickly. So what does this mean for Canadian immigrants, refugees, temporary workers, and other migrants in our country? Well, most major national and international health bodies have recognized the importance of social determinants of health. And in fact, they've acknowledged that who you are affects how susceptible you might be to COVID-19 and some of the complications that might happen to you. So in fact, even though the virus is blind to people's citizenship or visa status, immigrants can be especially vulnerable to infection, serious illness, financial hardship, and hateful discrimination, which we could have a whole discussion about what's going on in terms of discrimination. So in terms of social determinants of health and illness, how do these things fit together? So existing research in Canada and elsewhere tells us that diabetes is a risk factor for hospitalization and serious complication and death amongst COVID-19 patients. In fact, I saw this just on the CBC News yesterday. Recent research has shown that Canadian immigrants, particularly from South Asia, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America, seem to have a higher burden of diabetes. This is complicated by a whole different set of social determinants of health, which includes time since immigration to Canada, ethnicity, gender, immigrant category, income, and education level. So some of these aspects that I've highlighted earlier. What we don't know so much about in Canada, at least it's not very easy for us to find, is how this plays out in terms of the patients and the people who are hospitalized, or sadly the people who pass away from COVID-19. But we can look to our neighbors in the United States for some of this information because their health practices aren't as different as ours. And so preliminary data from New York City, for instance, shows that among Hispanic immigrants, 23 people out of 100,000 have died from COVID-19. That is a rate that is double that of white Americans and Asian Americans. So white Americans have a mortality rate of 10 out of 100,000, and Asians have an 8 out of 100,000 mortality. But for African Americans, the mortality rate is 20 out of 100,000 people, also very alarming. So these are rates of death that are much higher. We don't have this kind of comparable data in Canada, so we can't see exactly what's happening. And so this is part of the reason that we're having this conference, is to try to, get some, rally the troops to help us out. So why are newcomers at risk? So among COVID-19's many victims are migrants and refugees, who of course are susceptible to the virus, but also suffer additional harms due to discrimination and xenophobia. And in many places around the world, they're actually blamed for the disease. They're locked down, they're in cramped living arrangements, they have less access to medical care. So that social determinants of health approach has helped us to define that. Robert Reich, who is a very well-known economist in the United States, actually has been pondering about the social determinants of health and the impact of COVID-19 on immigrants and the American population. And he's got kind of an interesting typology. So he divides the population into 4 classes. The first class he calls are the remotes. These are the people who can work from home. These are the people we call the white-collar quarantine people, the people who are disrupted only because they have to move their work online. The other 3 groups are the essentials. Those are the people who can't work online, right? Your healthcare providers, your food distribution, truckers. We can name all these people. These are the essentials. They make up about 30% of the population. The unpaid are about 25% of the population. And so these are the people who are on unemployment insurance or people who can't work for various reasons. They make up about 25% of the population. And the rest of the population, which is about 10%, he calls them the forgotten. And this is a population that I'd like to kind of touch on with the last few minutes that I have with this presentation. The forgotten people, if we're talking about immigrants, refugees, and other newcomers, these are people who are living in migrant shelters in the US. Maybe they're living on a farm because they're seasonal workers. They might be our Indigenous friends who are living on isolated reservations, people who are living in homeless shelters, and people who live in long-term care homes. So these are the people who are the forgotten. And it's in these places where the forgotten people dwell, where there's outbreaks. Some of the biggest outbreaks in Canada and the US are amongst the forgotten population. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, well, how does this happen in Canada? So the first point I want to make is a slide I added actually just as I was listening to Mark speak, this infograph that Statistics Canada has on temporary workers. And so this is just a nice picture of the distribution of temporary workers in the agriculture sector from 2018. And I want to pick up one of the questions that was in the chat room about Jamaican workers, because it this past week it was announced that seasonal workers from Jamaica must sign a contract that they know they can't receive health insurance while they're in Canada, which is apparently a new thing. And I want to point out that Jamaican temporary workers in the seasonal agriculture industry make up 18% of that industry. 51% of them are from Mexico, 20% are from Guatemala. And so in Canada, the Canadian Centre for Refugee and Immigrant Healthcare reports that between 200 and 500,000 people living in Canada do not have health insurance currently. And there's other reasons too, right? There's the newcomers that have to wait for 3 months before they get their provincial health care, people who have overstayed their visas, refugee claimants, and that sort of people. So this is a real concern. 200 to 500,000 people who might be unwilling or too scared or can't afford to get healthcare treatment in the middle of a pandemic. The second point that I want to make also picks up a little bit on Mark's data as well. And that is that healthcare, elder care, food services, daycare, delivery services, they're all industries where immigrants and temporary workers make up a larger than their share proportion of the population. So I would refer you back to that data as well. And so thinking about the social determinants of health making these groups of people more vulnerable to COVID-19, which is what I will talk about right now, because what are the conditions of the spread? I have 2 more slides. So my colleague and friend Fairborz is going to talk about what's happening in High River with regards to the meatpacking plants there. But I do want to mention that amongst and these would be forgotten people, conditions that are conducive to the spread of COVID-19. In Canada, at least 8 of meatpacking plants have been closed, and that's as of today. A report from Reuters came out today. In British Columbia, they had to close 2 poultry processing plants in the last week because of cases. And if you look at what's happening to our friends and neighbors in the United States, this pattern of cases popping up in meat processing plants and seasonal agricultural workers is not unique to Canada. It's happening in the US. So many of you will have heard about Smithfield pork processing plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. That's one of the biggest meat packing plants in the US, although not the largest. But in that meat packing plant alone, 900 confirmed cases of COVID-19 have been identified. And if you've been to Sioux Falls, the population is just over 100,000 people. So that's a lot of people who have COVID-19. And the people who work in meat processing plants in the US have a similar demography than people in Canada. So their workforce at that particular plant is made up of immigrants and refugees from places like Myanmar, Ethiopia, Nepal, Congo, and El Salvador. They're often sitting side by side on the production line. So they're cramped together with one another. And if you look at what's happening in Canada, there's been an outbreak of COVID-19 on a couple of farms, one of these larger farms that bring in temporary workers. So the most recent one is at Greenhill Produce in Kentbridge, Ontario, where some 43 employees came down with coronavirus. Most of them were the migrant workers, although apparently they all caught it from somebody who was born in Canada. And I have a picture on the right-hand slide of the living conditions which people live in when they're working on a seasonal agricultural farm, although this one is from a farm in BC. But the provincial guidelines are very specific, but the provincial guidelines for how much space you need to give an immigrant who is working in a seasonal agriculture sector, the minimum amount of space is 7.44 square meters with a minimum of 8.5 cubic meters of airspace. And so to give you an idea of what that looks like, the photo on the right gives you an idea. It's pretty cramped living quarters, which will make it hard for social distancing even when they're not working. So my last slide is, some of the considerations that we need to think of that have an impact on immigrants in particular, but also will have an impact on other Canadians too. So, you know, as we are moving back to work or having safe working conditions, and again, this is not a whole list, but these are some of the things we need to think about. Reconfiguring our working spaces. So the photo on the top left is from the Cargill High River meatpacking facility. In fact, they've provided that photo, and you can see how close together they're working. And if you have really good eyes, you can see that some of them are not wearing masks. So we need to reconfigure our working spaces in a very different way. And not only do you have to reconfigure the space in the line in which they're working, but also across from each other too, because those tables are only about 1 meter long. Personal protective gear, Maple Leaf Foods in Brampton actually shut down because it couldn't find enough masks for its 340 workers. I do want to point out about washrooms at these facilities, but also washrooms in general. So SARS-CoV-2 is present in the feces of individuals for up to 3 weeks after they've been infected. And so the United States, France, and Israel are now monitoring sewage to see how many people are expressing the COVID disease in their feces. And the reason I have a picture of a set of toilets here, I don't know where they are. They're probably not in any of these facilities, but most of our public toilets don't have lids on them. And so when you flush the toilet, right, that there's these droplets that come out, or as you flush the toilet, you've got the handle, you put your hand on the handle. These are considerations that I haven't had heard a lot of people talking about, you know, as we move back to work. The final consideration, and there's many more that we could talk about, is in terms of translation. So if we go back to South Dakota, Sioux Falls, the Smithfield plant, over 40 different languages are spoken at that plant. So this is the one that has 900 cases confirmed. There's a huge language barrier because at first, only information was provided to the people in English. So you can see that there's going to be some problems about, you know, how we go about doing our work if we don't translate. So I've got in the bottom left-hand corner just an example of some of the great work that our settlement service and umbrella organizations are doing in terms of translating very important COVID-19 information into many different languages, particularly for seasonal agricultural workers and people who work in meat processing plants. So I think I just want to echo the comments made online that it's very important for us to collect this kind of information so that we can see who is being affected and who's being disproportionately affected. And if we don't collect data on ethnicity, indigenous status, immigrant status, we're not going to know this. And so we're going to lose a huge opportunity, first of all, to prevent transmission, right? So if we can identify people, we can prevent transmission. We can also identify people to get help to them right away, or at least more quickly. And in the longer term, if we have this information, we can use it to correct the inequalities in our social structures that lead to these different health outcomes in the first place, not just for COVID-19, but for health in general. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'll give it over to the next person.
Thank you very much, Laurie, for this extremely rich presentation that went from the theoretical and general down to the highly practical and up-to-date type of information. Thank you very much. Now, to continue on this theme of practical and on-the-ground situation, our next speaker is Feribors Virjandian. He has been the Chief Executive Officer at the Calgary Catholic Immigration Society for the past 17 years. A refugee himself when he left his home country of Iran, his work with refugees began first in Pakistan with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees before he came to Canada. So as you heard, Feribors is going to talk to us about the highly problematic situation in High River, Alberta. The mic is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me start by thanking Jack and his team by putting this together. I'm looking at it over close to 700 people are tuning in. Obviously, having the information, especially at the critical time and crisis time, is so important because then we can make some evidence-based decision. And I think that is just thank you for everybody to be participating, and also Jack and his team. So I'm going to actually divide my presentation in two sections. One is I'm going to give you a very brief overview of what is happening in this sector, and also focusing on what we experience and what we have learned in High River. Again, it's important High River and Brooks, and I'm sure you all know they have the big major meat packing plant that 7,500 cows are actually processed on daily basis. And what I have heard was actually they produce 75% of Canadian meat. And I think that is so important to keep them going for many, many reasons that you know. As the sector, obviously sector, again, Corinne mentioned that, I think the advantage we have a lot of staff members, including myself, that we have experienced a lot of crises in our life. We became refugee, so we escaped, we lived in a war-torn situation. So obviously that itself have helped us a lot. The other thing actually helped us a lot to react so fast and adequately was really the network and the relationship that between the sector exists. I mean, there are elders in the sector, we have umbrella organization, we have national organization. So for us to really to connect with each other and start talking on a national scope was not a major challenge. Everything was there. So also are the people that they support us, including IRCC, they also really did fantastic by bringing us together, creating some flexibility. And we have to remember March is a chaotic time for all the nonprofit organizations because of end of fiscal year. So we also were going through that year-end fiasco that we always experience. So saying that when the whole thing started, we probably were more informed because at the time, by March 1st, we had about over 500 refugees from almost 20 different countries living in the reception houses across the country. So prior to that, we were quite informed about what was happening because we worked with the international migration, and also we were really very careful about how we're going to manage this, hearing what was happening in other countries. So that was our advantage moving forward. Quickly, we had to assess who are our clients, who are the most needy client at this time. Again, we know prior to March 31st, if we look at the 3 months, probably we only had 100,000 recent immigrants coming in, and they were all in their initial settlement process, obviously more vulnerable. We have been settling a lot of high need refugees in the past 5 years. Obviously, that group became a high need for us to make sure that we respond to their needs, that we felt that they would be more vulnerable. Temporary foreign workers, again, everybody talks about how they live and how they community to work, and they try to minimize their cost living in Canada. So obviously the living condition is not as desirable as should be, especially the time that we have to keep social distancing and we have to do a lot of things that we didn't do before. So, and also there were another claimants. Nobody has mentioned that in the past 3 years, actually Canada has received a high number of refugee claimants. Many of them are being denied. They are in limbo in Canada, as well as the undocumented. And you will be surprised, even a city like Calgary received quite a number of, we knew that they exist. We have some as an agency relationship with them, but suddenly about 50 maybe families came on and they contacted us and they asked for help, because in a normal time, they don't want people to know they exist, obviously, because they are undocumented. So I think this is how we started the whole process across the country. One thing that helped us was really the early establishment of the task force, the working group within the provinces, in the cities, as well as on a national basis. So I think that really helped us in a number of ways. One was actually we tried to share the learning. So everything was learned in one part of the country, was quickly shared with another part of the country. And agency with the less capacity, especially the small centers, obviously they benefited from that. And also the funders, overall, IRCC in particular, they actually identified some flexibility in how we can use the resources to address the issues arising from the COVID-19. So this is how we started. So on the local level, I think agencies were encouraged to identify the high high need population. I mean, in the case of that arrival immigrant and refugee population can be really having a negative impact how they respond to the need of this population. That's what we learned. That's why we felt as a settlement sector, if we put our act together and we become more proactive, we actually would prevent these people going and accessing services on their own, which would be very challenging for a hospital to have a woman with a number of children to go there with no language, with no understanding of the system to navigate. So that is something we also offer, translation, connecting to the clients. One thing also we learned through the whole process was actually the settlement agencies have much more intimate relationship with the clientele, and also more information on the clientele. And I will speak to that when I go to the basically a high river situation. So one of the questions we had about the business continuity, as you mentioned, you heard that there were a number of people that we had in our reception houses, and the situation suddenly changed. Nobody was delivering furniture, nobody was going to connect the internet. So all those new environment, now we have amazing checklists that was developed quickly for the wrap providers. So they have to go through that, the readiness checklist that for basically processing that 500 people that they were in reception houses, and also how we're gonna continue within the COVID-19 environment if new arrivals are coming. We tested it in Calgary. We had a family of 6 arrived just about 18 days ago. So we actually tested that whole process and it worked. They arrived at the airport safely. We monitored them. We took them to reception house. We kept them for 15 days on the quarantine. And then now actually they are in their own accommodation. So that was quite a learning. And I think the sector is really actually ready with a limited number to do settle refugees and help immigrants. So for business continuity, obviously we had to go online services. Most of the program went online. Some of the agency, we had to keep our offices open with a restrict the COVID-19 protocol in place, because we felt that there's no other place for these people to go. Again, as I said, very limited access, but definitely we made sure that if people feel that they need to go somewhere, the agencies are available for them. And we had to actually learn and develop a quarantine process for our reception houses. That was also a big learning. Again, today we know that we had no cases. That is really amazing. And I think a lot of credit to across the country to settlement workers and as well as the agencies. I mean, in the case of Calgary, we just had 7 people with the symptoms that quickly they were tested and then the result came negative. So that was really a good thing to make sure that the system is working. And we had to develop a lot of protocol. We had to make sure our environment, our offices are safe, our staff are safe, volunteers are safe, and also our clients are safe. So through that, we quite actually developed some amazing protocol together. We shared it across the country, and I think everybody now has a clear idea of how to continue delivering services while keeping everybody safe. The other thing we had to do is actually going to the develop a strategy to respond to urgent needs. As I said, the 500 people in Calgary, and I'm sure the similar numbers in different cities, we made sure they stay at home, they understand all the advices coming from the health authority. Again, you have to remember the school were closed, so all the kids were at home, making sure they have access to some entertainment daily. Sometimes for some clients, we had about 1,200 Yazidis across the country, but close to 350 of them in Calgary. So daily contact with them, looking after their mental health, their anxiety level. So all those things happen in a context of, in a really a short period of 10 days. And I think we should all be proud of how we have basically managed to respond to this whole process, I think. So again, I'm finishing this part of my presentation by saying that the sector has done amazingly well, getting a lot of support from our funders and also a lot of support from our community. And I think the community, we try to really also educate the community that these people that are working at the nursing home, food processing places, they are still cleaning their offices, they are just taking an additional risk and they need a lot of respect. So that backlashing about immigrant or temporary foreign workers is something that we needed to educate our community, and I'm sure that there are going to be more education on national basis, because I think these people have kept whatever economy we had in past 6 weeks going, and I think they looked after our elders, they prepared food for us so we can see that home. I think those messages has to be repeated in the community so everybody would be aware of that. So I'm going to go now to talk about the High River, because I think this is very important, the learning we had there. My agency, Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, we are a bit in a unique position, because although we serve in Calgary, but we are in eight locations outside Calgary, including High River and Brooks, those two centers that we identified as a high risk, obviously. So when we started hearing about things happening and people, we understood, because it was very clear, you know, Cargill, for instance, we are very confident how they have developed strategies within their workplace actually, how to keep them safe. But one thing they had no really control, or maybe not a good understanding, was when they leave the plant, they get into the van with 700-800 other people, they go to a house with a crowded house, and that is how I think the problem started, the outbreak started there. We also quickly learned that the people working in that small High River, they don't necessarily live in High River. Many of them, they commute from Calgary and another community called Okotoks. So we also had to alert those two other communities and make sure that they are also, they understand that people working in High River, not necessarily all working at a Cargill. There are other employers that they are also using temporary farm workers. So again, I know we don't have that much time. So again, these are the things everybody have actually identified, that we knew it was not really a secret that the recent refugees, that they work in those plants, because we supply a lot of those people through our agency to Cargill and GBS in Brooks, and also temporary foreign workers, they are facing additional risk, because the way they live, the kind of work they do, and share accommodation and share transportation. So we try to bring that to attention of the employers and even the towns, but again, you know, there were so many other priorities that they may not have taken it as serious as they could have. Now, again, one of the things we knew that they are doing carpooling and for them, you know, keeping that social distances, all others would be very difficult. Again, living condition was so important for, and as you saw from the Lori's presentation, that they were not really living in a condition that they could observe all the advices from the health authorities. So they had to really just, you know, bear with that. So one of them, if they were in doing a cleaning job and got the infected, obviously would be a high percentage that would be she or he would basically infect other people. So one of the things very quickly, what we know that employers have to pay more attention what happens when workers are leaving their job. The smaller centers, they are not having capacity, so there has to be an outside organization that would help them in case what happens. One of the challenges initially we had was a centralized, accurate data. Everybody had their own data. Again, we understand businesses are reluctant to share their information, at least in the beginning, because of the liability and publicity. So, but that was one of the challenges we had, but quickly was put together. That actually we learned that if we have the data is so important to make sure that people understand that there should be data available for easy access. And also host community respond to negativity to the members of this this target population, because again, I explained, they need to be portrayed as basically really people are taking more risk because for the rest of us, not as a cause of the problem. So what we have learned was so far that it's important, regardless if they have outbreak or not, they need to go ahead and just develop a centralized, accurate data of temporary farm workers and recent refugees that work in those places. Again, we need our public institutions have to have a better understanding of a composition of this population, the linguistic, the culture, because if they don't, then I think it would be much difficult to really respond quickly and efficiently while the pandemic is going on. And the other thing was ongoing communication between the agencies and the authority and the agencies on the ground, because that is where actually we will see the impact negatively or positively if there are good coordination there. And we have some number of recommendations we wanted to make that we have made. This document actually was developed just last week, 3 days into the COVID-19, the outbreak in Brooks and High River, and we actually have shared that with everybody. And I tell you that in Brooks, they are much better prepared now. All the people have already been called. We had to call about 2,000 families to do a survey for the city and the emergency response team to actually make some decision, which is based on the informed decision and evidence-based decision. So we are basically recommending every small center that they do utilize temporary farm workers or recent immigrant or refugee, they should have a centralized database. The FCSS or settlement agencies available, they should be tasked to do that. We also have to have more aggressive monitoring of temporary farm workers arriving. As we speak, we know that temporary farm workers are coming. And I think I had a conversation with about 24 mayors organized by Martin Scheel, the MP, at smaller centers. Our industry, our farmers, they depend on these people. So I'm not saying they shouldn't be coming at all, but what I'm saying, they should be very rigid protocol to monitor these people from the day they arrive at the airport till they go to the workplace. And also there should be a very, very clear protocol to monitor them and provide them with a safe environment to make sure they are safe and the community safe as well. And I think we have recommended every local community, they should actually have a response, and actually they should test it to be ready. So they know the rules, they know the responsibility, they know, they understand better who are more at risk. So that would really help to respond to an outbreak such that we experience there. And again, more education on self-isolation and also ability to self-isolate, because when we ask people to self-isolate, as Lori's mentioned, a lot of these people may not have the capacity to actually go and find a place that they would be isolated and the food and others things would be our basic need are met. So we have to do that as well. And again, the language obviously is important, how to communicate with them, and I think they can use the resources that are available in other agencies, not necessarily in the small center, but in other centers. Now, my last poster is actually shows you how we have managed Calgary situation. As you can see, there was a lot of thinking has gone into this. I mean, as today we probably responded to over 200 responses. That mean that people called us, they were short in medicine, or they did not have food or protective gears, or they had severe anxiety that were attended to. So I think so far I'm so happy with the response of my colleagues and the community of Calgary, High River, Brooks, and the whole Alberta to really manage the crisis that we are facing. And just got a report, for an update report just a few minutes ago about High River situation. I think that crises are over. We are more in the support and maintenance mode. So that's the good news I wanted to share with you. So I stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ferry Boris. This is a presentation that really highlights the links and the importance of keeping these links between data and information and organizations that are providing services on the ground, and how effective they become even more when they use that kind of data. Our last presenter, panelist, is Shamira Madani, and she's been for a couple of years the Managing Director for Canada at the World Education Service, and she's also the Deputy Executive Director for World Education Services. She was, before 2018, a public servant, and she spent a great deal of her career, notably with the Ontario Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration. So, Shamira, you're the last panelist. You can now start.
Okay, so thank you so much, and no pressure when we have about 15 minutes left, but I'll attempt to go through the presentation fairly quickly because the context has been set. In terms of the context, and we've heard a lot about this in the last few hours, that at the peak there were 195 countrywide closures. Everything from basically, every single country, including our top source countries, from a World Education Services perspective, India, where we get almost 50% of our clients, has the world's strictest and most wide-ranging lockdown, and this lockdown has continued. This has included borders from the Philippines, where in fact the country has forbidden any health workers from leaving the country because they want to make sure that with the pandemic in their country, as infections go up, they have their own health workers there, Nigeria, Pakistan, etc. So we know that this situation continues with international airport closures, etc. In terms of what we have done here is basically we wanted to, at WES, understand what people's thinking was with respect to whether they were still interested in coming to Canada as immigrants. And this was what we call a rapid response in terms of going to our applicants who were prospective immigrants. And in a couple of minutes, I'll show you for those who are already here. So the good news here is that, in fact, majority of these individuals, prospective immigrants, are saying that they're still interested in coming to Canada, and that there hasn't been an impact, notwithstanding, a number of emergency orders and border closures. And we suspect that that is because a number of other countries, especially our sister country in the US, there have been immigration policies that will prevent people from coming. So this is good news with respect to people's intention of still wanting to come. We have heard this already from one of our panel presenters, that in fact the new economic reality is that until the pandemic hit, we were at full employment. And you heard this morning, although I have Q2 projected percentages, Q3, it will be 15% of individuals who basically are unemployed, almost 2.2 million people. And what our census data shows, and everybody, I know is familiar with this, is that in fact 1 in 5 Canadians are immigrants. In the GTA, more than 50% are immigrants and visible minorities. And so when you look at the percentage in terms of unemployment, we know for a fact that majority of these individuals will be vulnerable peoples, especially immigrants, especially visible minorities, and especially those who might be in precarious employment situations. The other thing too is that what we do know in terms of the data is that in fact an estimated 500,000 immigrants do not qualify for the new emergency relief benefits, either because they were working part-time and didn't meet the criteria, or they in fact left the workforce before the benefits came in. And so, when I talk about 16% without any financial support, that's what we're looking at. With respect to the hard-hit sectors, as we were looking at, so where have the hard-hit sectors come from? And if you look at that, in fact, already with the healthcare and social assistance sectors, that's where we had the biggest impact. We know that a high number of immigrants work in the food and beverage industry. It's the only place that you can find jobs quickly, and then everything else. So you can see that immigrants who are already here have already been impacted as a result of the pandemic. So the question that we asked in terms of this rapid response survey is, you know, as an immigrant who is already in Canada, have you experienced, and you see the questions in front of you. And what you see here already is that, in fact, a significant number are what we call essential workers and still have to go to work. In terms of what these sectors could look like, it's either in the healthcare sector, the long-term care facilities, as cleaners, in sort of, you know, some other areas where people have to go because it's called essential work and they have no choice. They can't stop working because it might be a part-time job. So when we look at basically what we call a reality check, the 80.3% employed looks really good. This is a research study that we did in 2019 where we released the data. So although you have almost 80% of individuals who are already here, the 1 million who came over the last 3 years, who are highly educated, in fact, many were not working in their previous occupations. They basically, their education and skills were being wasted. They were just taking whatever job as a stopgap. And so, in fact, the reason why I put this slide in front of you is that as a result of the pandemic, not only did you already have a situation where people couldn't basically work in their previous occupations or skills, the pandemic has created a worse situation. However, in terms of what we have seen already, and what I want to do is go to where Corinne talked about being resilient and starting to talk about recovery. Because, you know, for the last 2 or 3 hours during the conference, we've talked about the impact now, and it feels really depressing. But the reality is that, you know, we will move into a recovery stage. And what we want to do is make sure, and at least that's the work that we're doing at West with a number of partners, is that as we start recovering our economy, even if it's in phases, we know that we have a very large number of immigrants who will be left behind because just by default, and one of the speakers, Lori, spoke about the impact, the health determinants. We know that that's going to be an issue for immigrants, especially because as employers start gearing up, they will start looking at who do I know, what do people look like, and immigrants will be left behind. And so from our perspective, the resilience and recovery comes from the fact that we have to be very proactive in putting tools and processes in place to get ready for what that recovery looks like. So I have basically at this point 3 ideas and opportunities that we're putting on the table and starting to think about. So we call it the immigrant inclusive economic recovery. The first is inclusive recruitment and hiring strategies. And so what that looks like is we basically, instead of doing the one-offs and you know, going out and saying, here are the resumes of individuals and job search, which is very important, we've got to do it a lot more quickly, because as the economy opens up, we need to think about how best do you have immigrants who are highly skilled to hit the ground running. So we did have something that we had done with refugees. It's called inclusive hiring for refugees, a very powerful model where it was a one-day session where literally immigrants were getting ready for, and you know, usually organizations like Access and Costi supported these refugees to be ready to go in for an interview. Employers were ready. And literally it was not a job fair, but a one-day executive search form kind of model. And after this particular session, we had almost 80 people in one day who were offered positions. And then there were second and third sessions. So what our thinking is that these kind of models need to be replicated all across so that employers are basically ready to see the talent in front of them and they don't have to go through the one-offs. The second is to look at new strategies and tools that recognize recognition of skills in education. Education is very important. That's the core business of World Education Services. However, if you want to look at a rapid response, what are the skills that people have and how do you assess the skills and what kind of tools do you have in place. So you have heard the whole concept of competency assessment. So, how do you evaluate the skills I have and how am I going to be able to contribute those skills that an employer may not be familiar with in the workplace? So that's again some work that we are doing. We have pilot tested a few tools that, at the next session I'm happy to speak to in terms of what that looks like. But we need to be being proactive and doing a lot more work around skills assessment, that's especially online, because we've talked about this in the last 3 hours. Everything is going to be online. So how do you go about using different methodologies to do the assessment, and so that it's rapid for employers and people can go into the workplace fairly quickly? The last part is that really what we want to make sure is that people should understand that as immigration and IRCC is doing really good work to make sure that people are going to come in when the borders open up. We have 1 million people who have actually come to Canada in the last 3 years. They're in front of us, and we want to make sure that we use the skills that they brought with them. And so what we want to do is make sure that people see them as they're in front of us and that they shouldn't be left behind. So another thing that we are looking at is that there is a philanthropic arm of World Education Services, where we will be looking at providing funding to do innovation and to do work that's going to be very different to try and expedite the entry of individuals when our borders open up. So my perspective is, Corinne, you finished the conversation with resilience. I think that resilience is really important. Also being proactive is equally important, because when the borders open up and things get to whatever the new normal is, we should be ready. With people in front of you, they're ready to contribute. I really expedited my presentation to give a few minutes for Q's and A's, so I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shamira. You've been very helpful in speeding that up. I'll try to speed things up also by trying to summarize in 3 baskets the type of numerous questions that were asked, and asking our panelists to choose a topic that they might want to discuss. The first topic would be the type of people that are affected. A number of questions having to do with refugees, people with disabilities, and undocumented immigrants. How you are in your work dealing with these special needs. Second type of questions has been the government response. So Corinne, je pense que ce type de question t'est adressé en particulier, mais how will government do this? Will government do that? Among other things, providing health insurance. Well, that would be for provincial governments, temporary foreign workers. I suppose IRCC might have a view on that. Another type of question was, is there going to be an automatic extension of work permits for people who are already here and stuck in Canada? A number of questions, therefore, about the type of further work that government can do. And finally, and I guess Shamira and Peribor's presentation really dealt with that, so maybe you want to continue on that theme. The collaboration between government and service organizations on the ground. And Laurie also dealt with this aspect of things in very practical fashion. How can we further the collaboration in order to face the challenges that COVID-19 has presented? So I won't pick anybody, but please jump if you want.
Maybe I'll start with the last question, just so that we can get through that in terms of the collaboration with government. And I didn't give you the example, but now I'll use the example. You know what's happening in Ontario and in other provinces like Quebec in the long-term care facilities. What we realized really quickly is that we have a very large number of internationally educated health professionals who wanted to contribute to the pandemic. We, together with Okazi, TRIAC, and with Costi approached government and said, you know, there are a number of internationally educated immigrants who could contribute, and would you basically work with us? And government was right there immediately saying, what can you do? How can we work in collaboration? And in fact, as a result, a number of things have happened, including one hub kind of portal for individuals who want to contribute to go and sign up and start contributing. So I just wanted to give you an example that at this point, everybody is in this together, and government is very much, we're a partner, we want to do this together. The same for the federal government. So it's just a concrete example in terms of how it has worked before.
Thank you, Shamira. Anybody else? You have to unmute yourself, Corinne.
Yeah, maybe I just repeat what I said. I think crises become even more crisis if we are not prepared. I think that whole sense of preparation and sense of readiness are becoming so important, I think. And again, we have learned in the past 6 weeks, and these things is not going to go away. We know that, and is hopefully will be easier to deal with it now. We believe we have gone over the peak, but again, we never know. I mean, what we are hearing from other countries, it could come back the second wave. So the learning that we have today, implementing, not waiting, implementing. I made some very solid recommendation as far as the smaller centers go. I think those need to be in place. When the TFWs are arriving today, we have to have a centralized registry for them. So we need to know where they are. At this point, everybody holds a little bit of data, but it's hard to go to any province at this point to say, how many temporary farm workers do you have and where they are? I think we need to put that in place right away. I think that would be really helpful. And eligibility, obviously, I mean, everybody has mentioned this COVID-19, I think there is no status anymore. So I think agencies should be able to respond to the need regardless of the eligibility of the clients. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Corinne, tu voulais parler.
Thank you, Hubert. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Oui, on t'entend.
Oh, excellent. So lots of questions about the federal programs that have been stood up, the CERB and the very recent Community Response Fund. I'll start with just quickly the Community Response Fund. Our colleagues at Employment and Social Development Canada are working with 3 national organizations, and the funding is not yet rolling, but once it is, agencies will be able to apply directly to the United Way of Canada, the Community Foundations of Canada, or the Red Cross. And we will be giving our National Settlement and Integration Council further information on that as soon as our colleagues at ESDC have that complete. Lots of questions as well in terms of eligibility for the CERB, as well as the flexibilities that the government has put in place around employment insurance. And instead of trying to answer every specific question that I saw online, again, we've already provided that information through our National Settlement and Integration Council, but I do have a very useful set of 10 key questions and answers that I will see if I can get approval to send to the ACS to perhaps send out to participants. That might be a way to answer those questions and any others that come up as you read the answers. There was also a question about the comment I raised about IRCC increasing wages for those delivering critical service by up to 15%. Again, the department has sent out functional guidance on April the 21st on this improvement or enhancement. And it's critical services that we describe in the functional guidance. And I mentioned that on March the 16th, we worked with agencies to ensure that those were providing those critical services were able to continue to provide those services in person. And it's the 15% wage increase is specifically for those providing critical in-person services as defined in our functional guidance. So again, that information is out with all of our umbrella organizations, but I would encourage any agencies online today that have questions to contact your settlement network rep in your local community, because they can sort through the specifics of whether the services you and your staff are providing fit the definition of critical for this wage increase or not. I think I'll leave it there, Hubert. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Corinne. I have the difficult task of telling you, Laurie, that I'm asked by the host organization to stop it there. So I'll just thank you all for your fantastic and excellent presentation and turn it to Tasha.
Merci beaucoup, Hubert. Désolée de vous couper la parole tous. C'était vraiment super intéressant. Je veux remercier Hubert Lucier, Corinne Prince, Laurie Wilkinson, Fairbuz Biljandin et Shamira Madani pour cette session. We're supposed to hear from Nora Spinks. She, of course, is the Chief Executive Officer of the Vanier Institute, but in the interest of time, she has demurred. However, she has posted on Zoom, you can find in 30 different languages, a fact sheet in the chat section. If you want to go check that out, this information will also be posted, I believe, on the website of the Vanier Institute, if I'm not mistaken, and on the Association for Canadian Studies. Ces informations seraient aussi sur les divers sites web du Vanier et aussi l'Association des études canadiennes. And you will also be able to get a chance to hear her at the next conference, which is coming up on May 15th on the family. That will be hosted also by the Association for Canadian Studies, but of course, the more general group that we're thanking today, which is, get it right, COVID-19 Social Impact Network, le réseau COVID-19 sur les impacts sociaux. Thank you so much to everyone who worked so hard on this event today, and so much to all of you. Merci beaucoup pour vos questions, pour être là. On a retenu votre attention, on le sait par les chiffres. Alors, je vous souhaite une excellente journée. Thank you very much. Have a great day.